The alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning, same as every other morning for the past 16 months, and Pearl Briggs opened her eyes to a ceiling she had memorized without meaning to. The crack that ran from the light fixture toward the window like a river on a bad map. The water stain above the closet that had turned the color of old tea. The small brown spider that built its web in the same corner every week, no matter how many times she swept it down, persistent, in a way she had learned to respect. She lay still for a moment before sitting up. That was the hardest part, those first few seconds between sleep and waking, when the world felt blank and possible, before her mind caught up and reminded her of everything that was true. Wade was gone. The baby was coming. The eviction notice was on the kitchen counter beside a bill from the Clover Valley Reproductive Center for $9,400. Outstanding balance, please remit within 30 days to avoid collections. Pearl sat up carefully, one hand braced against the mattress, the other resting on the swell of her belly. 7 months along. The baby moved beneath her palm, a slow roll that she had come to think of as his morning greeting, unhurried and certain, already more confident in the world than she felt. She touched the curve of him and breathed. On the nightstand beside a glass of water and a bottle of prenatal vitamins sat a framed photograph. Their wedding day, March 2011. Pearl had been 26, wearing a dress her mother had helped her alter from a thrift store fine ivory satin that had once belonged to a stranger and now felt like the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. Wade stood beside her in his dress blues, 28 years old, square-jawed and dark-eyed and smiling the way he smiled when something genuinely surprised him with how good it was. She touched the frame with 2 fingers the way she did every morning. Not a ritual she had chosen so much as one that had chosen her, the way grief chooses its own forms of expression without asking permission. Around her neck on a plain silver chain hung his dog tags. She had not taken them off since the chaplain handed them to her at the funeral. She slept in them. She showered in them. They were cool against her sternum in the mornings and warm by noon, and sometimes at night when she pressed them against her lips in the dark, they still smelled faintly of him, or maybe that was just what she needed to believe. Corporal Wade Allen Briggs, United States Marine Corps. Blood type A positive, no religious preference. She had read those words so many times they had lost their meaning and gained a different one, something that had nothing to do with the military and everything to do with who he had been. Pearl stood slowly, steadied herself, and walked to the window. Whitfield County, Tennessee was coming awake in the early light, the sky gone pale gold at the horizon, where the hills pressed up against the dark. A dog was barking somewhere down the block. A truck idled at the stop sign on the corner, waiting for no one, the engine knocking in the cold. She had lived in this apartment for 2 years. Wade had carried the boxes in from the pickup, stacking them in the living room and making jokes about how their combined book collection weighed more than the furniture. They had painted the kitchen yellow on a Saturday in October, and the yellow was still there, a little faded, now the happiest color in a room that had grown very quiet. The eviction notice had arrived 9 days ago. She had 30 days from the date of issue to vacate or come current on the 2 months she owed in back rent. $1,400. She had $462 in her checking account. The distance between those two numbers had kept her awake on 4 separate nights, staring at the ceiling crack, running the same arithmetic over and over, and arriving at the same answer. The bill from the reproductive clinic was a different wound entirely. Wade had suggested freezing his sperm before his second deployment, sitting across from her at this same kitchen table in the yellow kitchen on a night in January 2020. He had not been dramatic about it. That was not how Wade operated. He had been practical the same way he was practical about everything that mattered, direct and unhurried and entirely serious. Just in case, he had said, "Hope for the best, prepare for the worst." Marine thing. She had nodded and signed the paperwork and told herself it was just a precaution, the way you wore a seatbelt on short drives. You did it because you were sensible, not because you expected the accident. Wade came home from that deployment. And the next one. He had left the Corps after his second tour, come home to Whitfield County, taken a job as a site supervisor with a local construction company, and they had built a life with their hands the same way they built everything, steadily and without drama. He died on July 14th, 16 months ago. Not in combat, not in any of the ways she had trained herself to fear during the deployments. He died on Route 7 outside of Millhaven, 12 miles from their apartment at 7 in the evening on a Tuesday in July. A drunk driver had crossed the center line and hit Wade's truck head-on. Wade was killed on impact. The drunk driver had walked away with a broken collarbone and a fractured wrist. The drunk driver's name was Terry Boggs. He had been driving a company vehicle registered to Hargrove Properties, LLC. He had been convicted of DUI manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years eligible for parole in 18 months. His employer, Dean Hargrove, had attended no court dates, issued no public statement, and faced no civil action. Pearl knew why. She did not have the documents to prove it, but she knew. Terry Boggs had been represented by a lawyer Pearl recognized from the county commission fundraisers, a man who worked primarily for Hargrove's various business entities. The criminal case had moved with unusual speed, Boggs accepting a plea deal before Pearl had found her footing enough to consult her own attorney. By the time she understood what had happened, the civil window was narrowing, and she had no money and no evidence, and a grief that sat on her chest like a stone at the bottom of a well. She had filed what she could. She had written letters. She had left messages with the county prosecutor's office that were returned with form responses about the case being closed. Wade was gone, and the man whose company vehicle had killed him had moved on to other business. She stood at the window for another few minutes, long enough for the light to change and for a car to pull out of the neighbor's driveway and drive south on Route 7 in the direction of the highway. She watched its taillights disappear around the bend and thought about something Wade had said once sitting on the back steps of their first apartment, looking at the mountains in the distance. "You can drive towards the mountains for an hour, and they never get closer," he had said. "They just get bigger." He had been quiet for a moment after that, in the way he was quiet when he was working something out. "That's the thing about the distant things," he said. "They don't get nearer, but you do get better at walking." She had not known what he meant then, or had known it intellectually without knowing it in the bones, the way you know things when they have been tested. She knew it now. She had been walking for 16 months, towards something that did not seem to get closer. But she was still walking, which was the main thing. She was still here. She was bringing Wade's child into the world. She was paying her bills and going to work and putting one foot in front of the other in the way he had taught her, steadily and without drama, because there was no other way that worked. She made herself coffee. She barely had time to drink and ate half a piece of toast standing over the sink. And she thought about the eviction notice, and she thought about the clinic bill, and she thought about the $714 she had moved between accounts last week, trying to find a configuration that added up to something adequate. And then she stopped thinking about all of those things, because none of them were solved by thinking about them in the yellow kitchen in the early morning, and she had a shift to get to. Pearl pulled herself away from the window. There was no comfort in returning to those facts, no insight she had not already excavated from them 100 times over. She got dressed in the diner uniform, black pants with an elastic waistband that still fit barely a white button-down shirt that she left untucked over the swell of her belly. Comfortable shoes that had stopped being comfortable 3 months ago, but were still better than the alternatives. She checked the eviction notice again before she left, the same way you check a wound you cannot stop touching. Then she walked to work. Harlan's Fork Diner sat at the intersection of Route 7 and Mill Road in the center of Millhaven, a town of 4,200 people in the eastern valley of Whitfield County. The diner had occupied that corner for 51 years under 3 different owners, the last of whom, Hazel Carver, had bought it with her late husband's life insurance payment in 1993 and run it ever since with the efficiency of someone who had been watching how things worked for a very long time. Hazel was 71 now, small and sharp-eyed with white hair she kept pinned back and hands that moved faster than her age suggested they should. She had known Pearl since Pearl was 16 and had come in looking for a summer job, had hired her twice, had attended both her bridal shower and her husband's funeral, and had been the one who drove Pearl to the reproductive clinic in Nashville the morning of the IVF procedure, sitting in the waiting room for 3 hours without complaint, reading the same magazine twice because she had not thought to bring another. She was behind the counter when Pearl arrived, the coffee already on and the griddle heating. She looked up and studied Pearl the way she always studied her in the mornings, a quick, complete inventory conducted without words. You didn't have to be here until 7, Hazel said. I know. Hazel handed her the coffee pot and said nothing else. That was one of the things Pearl loved most about her. The morning rush came in waves. Truckers first, then the contractors and early shift workers, then the farmers who had been up since before dawn and wanted something hot and unhurried. Pearl moved between the tables with the practiced economy she had developed over years of this work, refilling mugs before they were empty, remembering orders she had not written down, laughing at the jokes she had heard a dozen times as though they were new. Her back ached. Her ankles were thick inside her shoes. When she stood still at the counter between rushes, she could feel the pulse of her own exhaustion, like a second heartbeat deeper and slower than the one the baby moved against. But she did not let it show because showing it would invite a conversation. She did not have the energy for the conversation, where someone looked at her with their head tilted and asked if she was sure she should be working this hard right now. She was sure. She had no choice, and she had learned that those two things were sometimes the same. By noon, the morning crowd had thinned. Pearl was refilling the salt shakers at the counter when she heard the motorcycles. The sound came from outside before she saw anything. A low rolling rumble that built from somewhere down Mill Road and grew until it vibrated in the glass of the front windows. She looked up and watched them turn into the lot. 6 motorcycles, big ones, Harley-Davidsons, mostly chrome, catching the flat December light. They pulled in together and stopped in a line like they had been doing this long enough that nobody had to be told where to park. The riders dismounted with the unhurried ease of people accustomed to long distances. They stretched, pulled off helmets, ran hands through road-flattened hair. They wore leather vests over long-sleeve shirts, and the vest carried patches on the back. Iron Road MC Nashville chapter. The center patch showed a highway stretching toward a horizon dark and straight and going somewhere. Pearl had seen club riders come through before. Millhaven sat on a route popular with weekend touring, and most of the clubs who came through were exactly what they looked like. Men who rode together and wanted coffee and a decent meal and not much else. These 6 looked like that sort. The man in front was older, early 60s, with gray at the temples of dark hair and a face weathered into a stillness that was not blankness. It was the stillness of a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He carried himself like someone who had learned to take up only as much space as he was entitled to, which was a considerable amount, but no more. He scanned the diner as he came through the door, a quick survey that missed nothing, and then he led his group to the large corner booth, the one that could seat 8 comfortably, and they filled it without crowding. Pearl brought menus and coffee. "Afternoon," she said, setting down the mugs. "Can I start you all off with something?" The older man looked up at her. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of overcast sky, and they moved over her with the same quality his entry scan had, quick and comprehensive, without being invasive. He took in her name tag, her face the obvious swell of her pregnancy, and then his gaze moved briefly and without comment to the dog tags hanging against her shirt. "Coffee's a good start," he said. "Black for all of us." "Coming right up." She poured and stepped back. As she did, she noticed his attention return to the dog tags for just a half second before he looked back at the menu. She thought nothing of it and moved to the next table. They ordered lunch burgers and the pot roast special and one order of chicken fried steak. They ate quietly in the corner booth, their conversation low enough not to carry 6 men who had clearly known each other long enough to sit in comfortable near silence. Pearl served them and moved on to her other tables. The older man watched her. She noticed it in pieces, the way you notice something at the edge of your vision that you cannot quite resolve. Not obviously, not constantly, but a returning attention that was not threatening but was observant in a particular way. He noticed the way she touched her lower back between tables when she thought no one was watching. He noticed the slight steadying breath she took before approaching each new customer. He noticed the way her smile never faltered, even when she clearly had nothing left to fuel it with. He noticed the dog tags. Pearl did not know any of this. She was too busy trying to finish the shift. At 12:45, a silver Mercedes turned into the diner's lot and parked in the space nearest the door. The diner did not go quiet when Dean Hargrove came through the door. It shifted. Conversations continued at the same volume, but changed pitch slightly, became a little more guarded. The way a room changes when someone enters, who has a particular kind of authority in that place. The kind that is not official, but is understood, the kind built from years of being the largest financial presence in a small county. Hargrove was 54, well-built and carefully maintained with silver hair, brushed back from a face that had stayed handsome past the age when it had any right to. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him with the ease of a man accustomed to spending money on things that held their shape. He walked in with two men behind him, younger and harder-faced, carrying the unmistakable posture of people paid to be present and unsmiling. Dean Hargrove owned 6 commercial properties in Millhaven, including the building that housed Harlan's Fork Diner. He owned 14 residential buildings in Whitfield County. He ran a property management company, a regional construction firm, and a development consultancy. He sat on the county planning board. He donated to the sheriff's reelection campaign every 2 years without fail. He also owned the building where Pearl lived through a shell company called Millstream Residential Holdings, LLC. Though Pearl had only learned that 3 weeks ago, when her landlord mentioned it in passing casually, the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows. He chose a booth near the center of the room. Hazel came out from behind the counter to take his order herself, her expression neutral and her movements precise, the way she moved when she was managing something difficult with insufficient tools. Pearl stayed at the counter hoping he was not in her section. He was in her section. She walked over with water and silverware. "Good afternoon," she said. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Hargrove looked up at her. He had the eyes of a man who cataloged things by their value to him, quick, in assessing in whatever category he placed people in. Once assessed, they stayed there. He looked at her face, her name tag, her belly. "You're new," he said. "I've been here about 9 months, sir." He smiled. It was a pleasant smile in the way that certain tools are pleasant when they are not being used. Accommodating, not warm. 9 months. He glanced at her midsection. "That's a coincidence." Pearl kept her expression even. "Your steak medium rare." "I'll be right out." She turned to go. "Your husband around?" he asked. She stopped, turned back. The question landed the way those questions always landed, with a weight that had nothing to do with the words themselves. "My husband passed," she said quietly, 16 months ago." Hargrove nodded slowly, the nod of a man processing information rather than receiving news. He said, "Shame," and then he smiled again. Pearl noticed that the smile and the sentiment did not arrive at the same time. They were separate things that happened to appear together. "I'll check on your order," she said. She walked back to the counter. Her chest felt tight. It was not what he had said. She had been asked about Wade by dozens of people in dozens of ways over the past 16 months, some clumsy, some kind, some simply curious. What made this different was the quality of his attention afterward, the way he had looked at her after she answered, as though her response had given him something useful that he was now tucking away. Hazel was watching from the kitchen window. Her face was careful and still. "You okay, honey?" "I'm fine." Hazel did not look convinced. In the corner booth, Vance Holden had heard the exchange. The acoustics in Harlan's Fork moved sound in particular ways, the corner booth channeling toward the center of the room. And Vance had spent 40 years developing the habit of listening to things not directed at him. You learn that in places where the things not directed at you were often the most relevant. He had heard the question and the answer. He had seen the pause before she turned back to the counter. He set down his coffee cup without making a sound. Beside him, Dalton Cross had gone still. The youngest of the group at 28, back from his second deployment for 3 years, and still moving through the world with the watchfulness of someone expecting the terrain to change without notice. His jaw was tight. Vance looked at him. The look said, "Wait." Dalton settled, but his eyes stayed on the center booth. Hargrove ordered. The steak came out. He sent it back, said it was overdone. The kitchen made another. He sent that one back too, underdone now. Pearl took both plates back to Hazel without expression, moving with the careful precision of someone conserving every resource. "He's doing this on purpose," Hazel said, her voice low. "I know. You don't have to keep serving him. It's my section." Hazel looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and turned back to the kitchen. The third steak was perfect. Pearl knew it was perfect because Eddie the cook, who had been at Harlan's Fork for 14 years and had the steady judgment of someone who had done a thing long enough to do it without thinking, told her so before she carried it out. She set the plate down without comment. Fresh side salad, extra bread. Hargrove cut into the steak, chewed, nodded. That wasn't so hard now, was it? His two companions produced identical thin smiles. Pearl stood with her hands clasped in front of her and waited. Hargrove looked up at her. You know, sweetheart, you'd be a lot easier to look at if you smiled more. Pretty face like that ought to show it off. The conversations at the nearest tables did not stop, but they changed character the way air pressure changes before a storm. Two women at the table by the window exchanged a look. The truckers at the counter went quiet in the specific way of men deciding whether something was their business. Is there anything else I can bring you, sir? That'll do for now. She turned and walked back to the counter, straight back, chin level, hands steady. She refilled the coffee station, even though it did not need refilling because her hands needed something to do, and the motion of pouring was one she could execute without thought. In the corner booth, Garrett Steele, who had arms that came from 35 years of working on engines and hands scarred in the particular way of men who use them for heavy labor, turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the saucer. Silas Donovan, who had been an Army chaplain for 12 years and had sat with more dying men than he cared to count, had gone very still. Brooks Keller, who had been a combat medic, was tracking the center booth without appearing to. Decker Ford, the electrician, had the look of a man running calculations he did not like the outcome of. Dalton Cross was watching Pearl. Vance watched Hargrove. 40 minutes later, Pearl brought the check. She set it down on the far edge of the table and stepped back. Thank you for coming in. Have a good afternoon. She turned. Dean Hargrove reached out and closed his hand around her wrist. The grip was deliberate, not violent in the way that leaves visible damage immediately, but tight and purposeful, the grip of a man who had learned that you could do a great deal to people as long as you stayed just below the threshold of what they could clearly describe afterward. Pearl stopped. Every muscle in her body went rigid. I wasn't finished, Hargrove said. His voice was pleasant. That was the worst part, how pleasant it was, as though pleasantness itself had been converted into something that could cut. Pearl looked down at his hand on her wrist. Then she looked at his face, and in a voice that was clear and quiet and carried further than she intended, she said the words she had been taught in a self-defense class 7 years ago. Please let go of me. He did not let go. He said something to the man on his left, something low, and the man produced a sound that was approximately a laugh. Pearl pulled her arm back, trying to free her wrist, and when she did, Dean Hargrove released her wrist, and in the same motion backhanded her across the face. It was not a full swing. It was the kind of blow calculated to hurt without leaving marks that lasted, the kind that existed for the message rather than the damage. But it made a sound that cut through every conversation in the diner like something sharp through something soft. The room went silent. Pearl stood with one hand pressed to her face, eyes wide, the shock of it running through her like cold water. Not just the pain, which was real, but the flat and ugly fact of what had just happened, that a man had put his hands on her in a room full of people and expected the room to look away. The ceiling fan turned overhead. Somewhere a child had stopped moving in her chair. And then 6 chairs in the corner booth moved back from the table. Not a scramble, not a rush. They moved with the controlled, unhurried deliberateness of men who had spent years learning the difference between reaction and response, who knew that the quality of a movement communicated as much as the movement itself. Vance Holden stood first. He was not the largest man in the room. He was 62 years old, 5 feet 11 inches, maybe 180 in his boots. He had gray at his temples and a face that carried its years without apology. He did not have the physicality of a man people feared on sight. He stood in the particular way of men who have stopped needing to prove anything, which is to say he stood fully upright and completely without performance, and he walked toward Hargrove's table the way water moves toward the lowest point, with absolute certainty and no hesitation. The 5 others spread without instruction, not surrounding the table, not creating an encirclement, just present. Garrett on the left side of the room, Silas near the counter, Brooks and Decker at intervals that covered exits. Dalton directly behind Vance, 3 steps back, his eyes on the 2 men flanking Hargrove. They did not say anything. They stood there. Hargrove looked up. The pleasant expression flickered. For just a moment, something behind it shifted and recalibrated, and Pearl saw it and understood in that instant that whatever the pleasantness was covering it had a different face underneath. Vance stopped 2 feet from the table. He looked at Hargrove for a long moment without speaking. The silence stretched to a length that made the two men beside Hargrove move small involuntary adjustments, a shift of weight, a repositioning of hands. Then Vance spoke, quietly, precisely loud enough for the people at the four nearest tables to hear without effort. You just put your hands on a pregnant woman in front of witnesses. That was all. No threat, no raised voice. A statement of fact entered into the record of what had happened in this room. Hargrove looked at him. The pleasant expression had reassembled itself, but it fit differently now, like something put back on a little crooked. You need to walk away, old man, Hargrove said. His voice was still controlled, still had the quality of a man who believed control was his natural inheritance. Vance did not move. We'll wait for the police, he said. From behind the counter, Hazel's voice calm and steady. I've already called them. Pearl looked at the room. 4 phones were out. 2 she could see clearly were recording. One belonged to Tommy Benton from the hardware store, holding it up with the careful intentionality of someone who understood exactly what they were preserving. Another belonged to a teenage girl at the table near the window who had gone very still and very focused. Hargrove understood mathematics. He had built everything he had on his ability to calculate to know when the numbers turned against him. He stood slowly with the smooth control of a man demonstrating that this was his choice. He adjusted his jacket. He looked at Vance with something cold and specific behind the pleasantness. This isn't over, Hargrove said quietly, close enough that only Vance could hear. Then he walked out of Harlan's Fork Diner with his 2 men behind him, got into the silver Mercedes, and drove south on Route 7. The room exhaled. Dalton was at Pearl's side before she had taken a full breath. He was careful about it, standing close enough to be present but not crowding her, his voice low and even. Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need a doctor? Pearl shook her head. Her hand was still pressed to her face. She was steady, she was standing, she was fine. She was also 34 years old and 7 months pregnant, and her face stung and her wrist hurt, and something inside her that had been clenched very tightly for 16 months had just developed a crack. I'm okay, she said. Hazel came around the counter and took Pearl by the arm, leading her to the stool nearest the register. She produced ice wrapped in a clean towel and pressed it into Pearl's hand without being asked. Vance came to stand nearby, not hovering at a respectful distance, the way a man stands when he wants to be available but understands the difference between that and intruding. Thank you, Pearl said, looking up at him. His eyes were kind and direct, and carried in them something she could not yet name, a quality of having seen something before, of recognizing something. Take your time, Vance said. His voice was gentler than she had expected for a man who looked the way he looked. She pressed the ice to her face. Around her, the room was returning to its rhythms. Conversations, picking back up silverware, finding its way back to plates. Though the quality of those conversations had changed, quieter and more careful. The sound of a room processing something it had not expected to be part of. The police arrived 17 minutes later. A cruiser and a plain sedan. Chief Whitfield in the sedan and Deputy Aaron Reeves in the cruiser, both of them stepping in with the expression of men walking into something complicated. Chief Whitfield knew Dean Hargrove. Everyone in Whitfield County knew Dean Hargrove in one way or another, but the chief knew him in the particular way of someone who received an annual donation to the Police Auxiliary Fund and had a plaque in the station lobby with Hargrove's name on a brick. He stood in the middle of the diner with his notebook out and his face carefully arranged into professional neutrality. Deputy Reeves was younger, 32, and had been in Whitfield County for 4 years after transferring from Knoxville. He moved through the room with the different energy of someone who had not yet absorbed the local customs around men like Dean Hargrove. He went to Pearl first. Can you tell me what happened, ma'am? Pearl told him. Calm, clear, factual. The wrist grab, her request to let go. The blow. The deputy wrote it all down. Then he collected the names of the phone witnesses and reviewed 2 of the videos on the spot, standing at Tommy Benton's table and watching the 32-second clip with an expression that did not need interpreting. He looked at Chief Whitfield. The chief's jaw was tight. We'll need to speak to Mr. Hargrove, Reeves said. I'll handle it, Whitfield said. Reeves's face said something his professional manner did not allow him to say out loud. He nodded. Before they left, the deputy turned to Vance. Can I ask you gentlemen to describe what you observed? Vance walked him through it, precise and economical, the same voice he had used with Hargrove. The other five provided brief corroboration. None of them had touched Hargrove. None of them had been closer than 4 feet. Reeves noted all of it. Good, he said more to himself than to them. We'll be in touch. After they left, the diner settled. Pearl was still on the counter stool, the ice held against her cheek, when Vance walked over and stood at the edge of her space. Ma'am, he said quietly, may I ask you something? Of course. He hesitated. A beat, the kind of pause that comes before something a person has thought about saying and is now deciding how. Then he nodded toward her necklace. Those tags, he said, may I ask who they belong to? Pearl's hand went to them automatically. The worn edges of the metal, the familiar weight of them. She held them for a moment and looked at this stranger and decided the way she decided things all at once. My husband, she said, Corporal Wade Allen Briggs, United States Marine Corps, 2 tours in Iraq. She paused, and the pause came from somewhere deep in her chest, and she kept her voice steady anyway. He passed 16 months ago. Vance went very still. It was the kind of stillness that people around him noticed. Garrett and Silas and the others who had been quiet throughout went a different quality of quiet, the way a room changes when something important is about to be said. Pearl watched his face. He was not performing the stillness. It was genuine, the stillness of a man whose mind had just encountered something that required complete interior attention. Wade Briggs, Vance said. His voice was barely above a whisper. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Pearl's breath caught. Yes, how did you... He was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. On November 19, 2007, outside Fallujah, my Humvee convoy hit an IED on a supply route. The vehicle flipped and caught fire. I was in the second seat and I was trapped. He paused. Rounds were still coming in from the tree line. 2 of my guys were already down. Pearl had stopped breathing. Corporal Wade Briggs was on foot patrol 200 meters away when the IED detonated, Vance continued. By the time I had processed what had happened, he was there. He came through the kill zone while the insurgents were still shooting. He pulled me out of the burning vehicle through the rear window. He got a burn across his shoulder from the frame, and he did not stop moving. He got me 60 meters from the vehicle before it fully went. Vance's eyes were wet. I was medevac to Landstuhl. Spent 4 weeks in the hospital with 2nd-degree burns on my left arm and shrapnel in my back. By the time I could ask about the man who pulled me out, I was told he had rotated stateside. The unit information I had was incomplete. His file was partially sealed at the time due to an ongoing incident review. He paused. I have been trying to find Wade Briggs for 17 years. The diner had gone quiet again. Not the careful quiet of earlier, not the quiet after the slap. This was a different silence, the kind that comes over a room when it understands it is witnessing something larger than the room itself. He never talked about it, Pearl whispered. He never told me. Vance's voice was rough. That sounds like him. You didn't know him? No. But that sounds like the man who ran into a kill zone without hesitating. Men who do things like that generally do not talk about them. Pearl looked at this stranger with his weathered face and his gray-blue eyes and his 17 years of looking, and something inside her that had been very cold for a very long time moved. She started to cry. Not from the slap, not from the fear of Hargrove, or the exhaustion of the shift, or the weight of the eviction notice on the counter at home. She cried because, for the first time since the chaplain had put those dog tags in her hand and told her Wade was gone, she felt something she had not been able to name in 16 months. She felt him. Not his absence, which was what she had been living with, but his presence reaching across everything, across 17 years and a continent, and whatever lay between the living and the dead, reaching toward her the way he always had, steady and certain, and not asking for thanks. Vance stood there and let her cry. He did not move away, and he did not say anything, because some moments do not require words, and sometimes the most decent thing a person can do is simply remain. Hazel's arm came around Pearl's shoulders. Dalton, back at the booth, had turned toward the window. Even Garrett Steele, who had not appeared to be paying attention to anything but his coffee, was very still. When Pearl could speak again, she looked up at Vance through the blur of tears. "Why are you here?" she managed. "Of all the days, of all the diners." Vance was quiet for a moment. We came through on Route 7 on our way north, he said. We needed lunch. He paused. I don't believe in coincidence. I believe in debts. And I believe some debts don't expire just because the person you owe them to is gone. Pearl pressed the backs of her hands to her eyes. She breathed. What does that mean, she asked. Vance looked at her steadily. It means we're not leaving, he said. Outside, the afternoon sun had moved and the light through the front windows had gone from flat to slanted, the kind of light that makes ordinary rooms look like they belong in paintings. Pearl held the ice against her cheek and breathed. And after a while, the breathing steadied into something that felt less like surviving and more like being present. Vance returned to the corner booth. He sat down and looked at his brothers, 5 men who had ridden with him long enough to understand the difference between the conversations that needed words and the ones that had already happened between them silently in the particular language of people who have seen the same things and come through the same fire. We're staying, he said, quiet and flat, not a question. Garrett Steele nodded once. He was the mechanic of the group had been since he came back from the Gulf War at 23 and found that fixing engines was the only thing that made the noise in his head go away. He had big hands and a deliberate way of moving the way of a man who had learned that carefulness mattered more than speed. How long, Garrett asked. Long as it takes. Silas Donovan leaned forward on his elbows. He was 59, the former Army chaplain with a gray beard kept carefully trimmed and the particular bearing of a man who had spent years walking into rooms where terrible things had just happened and being required to be the steadiest person present. He had that quality now. What's the play, Vance? We find out what her situation is. Vance's gaze moved to Pearl, who was sitting at the counter with Hazel beside her, the older woman's hand resting on her shoulder. Then we figure out what she needs and how to provide it without making her feel like charity. He paused. She's got pride. We've all got that kind. Dalton Cross, 28, the youngest, who had come back from his second tour with a quietness in his eyes that his mother said wasn't there before, had been watching Pearl since Vance spoke. He had a particular way of noticing things, the attention of someone trained to observe and report to see what the situation actually was, rather than what it appeared to be. She's about to lose her apartment, he said. I heard her on the phone before the lunch rush. 10 days on the eviction notice. Vance looked at him. Her landlord called while she was in the back getting silverware, Dalton said. I wasn't trying to listen. It carries in here. Vance was quiet for a moment. What else? Medical bills, Dalton said. I caught the end of it. Something about a clinic. She's making payment plans. Brooks Keller, who had been a combat medic and had the steady, unhurried quality of someone who had learned to assess damage without losing his nerve, had been watching Pearl with professional concern. He had seen that particular quality of exhaustion before, the kind that sat in the bones rather than just the muscles, the kind that meant a person had been running on reserves for too long. She shouldn't be working doubles at 7 months, he said. The stress is bad for the pregnancy. Blood pressure, cortisol levels. She needs to be resting more, not less. She needs to eat, Decker, Ford said practically. He was the electrician of the group 44 and built Compact, a man who fixed things for a living and had a way of looking at problems that moved directly to solutions without lingering over their complexity. We'll feed her, Vance said, and we'll figure out the rest. He looked at Hazel Carver, who had come out from behind the counter and was standing at the edge of the booth with an expression that was cautious and tired and hopeful in equal measure. Hazel studied him for a long moment. She had been running this diner for 32 years and had developed the particular skill of reading people the way some folks read weather. You boys serious about helping her, she said. Yes, ma'am, Vance said. She looked at each of them in turn. Then she pulled a chair from the nearest empty table and sat down. Back rent's $1,400, she said quietly. Eviction notice came 9 days ago. She's been trying to come up with it, but the shifts here don't quite reach, and she's already stretched on her medical bills. The IVF, Vance said. Hazel looked at him. How do you know about that? I heard her say clinic. Hazel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Wade froze his sperm before his last deployment. After he died, Pearl decided to go through with it. The baby she's carrying is his. Last thing she has of him. The booth went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Lord Garrett said softly, Whole procedure cost $12,000. Hazel continued. She had some saved, took out a payment plan on the rest. She's current on the payments, but barely, and the eviction is going to eat what margin she has. She shook her head. She won't take charity. I've tried. She's too proud, which I understand, but pride doesn't pay rent. It doesn't have to be charity, Vance said. He looked at his brothers. Wade Briggs pulled me out of a burning vehicle while people were trying to kill us both. He saved my life. I never got to thank him. He paused. What I owe him, I'm going to pay to his widow. That's not charity, that's a debt. Hazel looked at him. Her eyes were sharp, and her face was composed the face of a woman who did not make the mistake of confusing gentleness with weakness. You can't just give her money, she said. She won't take it. Then we frame it right. Veterans Relief Fund, which is what Silas runs. Silas nodded slowly. We've got about 14,000 in the fund right now. All donations, all designated for military families in need. Pearl Briggs qualifies in every respect. I can cut a check today. Anonymous Vance said. We don't want her feeling like she's been managed. Anonymous Silas agreed. Her car, Dalton said. She drives a 2013 Honda Civic. I saw it in the lot. Front passenger wheel looks wrong, might be a bearing. Exhaust has a rattle that sounds like the heat shield's loose. I can look at it, Garrett said immediately. If she'll let me. She'll let you if we explain it right, Vance said. Tell her it's part of the debt. A brother helping a brother's family. And the medical side, Brooks said. VA benefits. Has she applied for survivor support? Hazel shook her head. I don't know that she knows what she's entitled to. A lot of them don't, Brooks said. The system doesn't go out of its way to inform people. But as a surviving spouse of a Marine who died within 5 years of active service, she qualifies for substantial support. Full prenatal coverage through the VA monthly survivor benefit payments. I have a contact at the Nashville VA hospital, Dr. Margaret Wynn. She works with military families, helps them navigate the process. I can call her today. Do it, Vance said. They paid their bill. Vance left $200 on a tab that had come to $63. When Hazel looked at it, he said for Pearl, whatever she needs. Whatever she... Hazel took the money and folded it into her apron pocket and looked at him with an expression she had not allowed herself to show before. Thank you, she said, quiet and direct. Not yet, Vance said. Ask me again in a month. They walked out to the bikes, but they did not leave. Instead, they gathered in the parking lot in the cold afternoon air and talked quietly about the plan, each man knowing his part. At a motel at the edge of town, 3 rooms clean and adequate, they settled in. The plan was in motion. Tomorrow it would begin in earnest. But first, at 6 o'clock, Vance walked back into Harlan's Fork Diner alone. The dinner crowd was lighter. Families, couples, a handful of solitary diners with their phones. Pearl was working, moving between tables with the same practiced efficiency, a little slower than the afternoon shift. The exhaustion deepening in the hours the way it always does toward the end of a long day. She saw him come in. She stopped for just a moment. Then she walked over with a menu. Evening, she said. Just coffee and a few minutes of your time if you can spare them. She looked at Hazel, who gave the smallest nod. She brought the coffee and slid into the booth across from him, hands folded on the table. I want to help you, Vance said. No preamble. He had learned a long time ago that circumnavigation was a form of disrespect when the person receiving the information was strong enough to handle it directly. Pearl's expression shifted, not closed exactly, but considered. I don't take charity. It's not charity, it's a debt. Explain the difference. He told her about Fallujah. All of it the same way he had told it before, without decoration or self-pity. The IED, the fire, Wade running across 200 meters of active fire to reach a burning vehicle. The pull through the window, the carry to safety, the hospital in Germany, the 4 weeks. The question he had asked as soon as he could speak clearly, who was the Marine who pulled me out? And the answer that had taken him 17 years to verify. Pearl listened without interrupting. She looked at her hands sometimes and at him sometimes, and her face moved through things that were private and deep. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He never told me that story, she said. No. He told me about the deployments, general things. He never described individual actions. She paused. He said once that it felt like bad luck to talk about the things that went right, like you would use them up. Vance smiled. That sounds right. What kind of help, she asked. Medical coverage you are entitled to and have not applied for. housing if the eviction goes through, your car which needs attention, and the back rent which can come from a veterans relief fund that exists precisely for situations like yours. He looked at her steadily. You won't owe us anything. The debt is paid to Wade, not to you. You're just the direction we're paying it. Pearl was quiet for a long time. Outside, the night had come down on Millhaven, the windows showing dark and the streetlights making small orange pools on the asphalt. I need to know everything, she said finally. No surprises, no decisions made without my knowing. Fair. And I pay back what I can when I can. If you insist, I do. Then we have a deal. They shook hands across the table. Her grip was firm, the grip of someone who understood the weight of an agreement. Hazel watched from the kitchen doorway and allowed herself to feel for the first time in many weeks something tentatively adjacent to hope. That night after her shift, Pearl came out to the lot to find Garrett Steele standing by her Civic with a flashlight and a notepad moving around the car with the methodical attention of someone who understood machines the way other people understand language. He looked up when she came through the door. "Ms. Briggs," he said, "Cole asked me to take a look, with your permission." She stood for a moment. The cold was settling in the kind of Tennessee cold that comes in December, like a slow water rising, not brutal but insistent. "Go ahead," she said. He popped the hood and shone the light inside. After a couple of minutes, he moved to the front driver's wheel, then the rear. He straightened up. "Front wheel bearings going," he said. "Exhaust heat shields loose. Brake pads are down to about 30%. You've got a slow leak in the left rear tire." She looked at the car. "I know," she said quietly. "Good news is none of this is catastrophic yet. But the bearing you want to address soon. If that goes while you're on the highway, it gets dangerous fast. I can't afford to fix it right now. What if someone else wanted to?" Pearl looked at him. In the cold parking lot light, she could see the scars on his hands, the deep-set lines of a man who had spent decades in honest labor. "Why would you do that?" "Because your husband saved Vance's life," Garrett said. "And because Vance is my president and my brother and I would do most anything he asked. But also," he paused, "my father was in Korea. Never talked about it much, same as your husband. Came home and just went to work and built his life. Men like that don't ask for much. But the people they leave behind deserve better than to be left on their own." Pearl felt the tears coming and blinked them back. She had cried twice today already, more than she had cried in the previous 3 months combined. "How much will it cost?" she asked. "Parts maybe 800. Labor's free." "I don't have 800. Already taken care of." "By who?" "By people who owe Wade Briggs a debt," Garrett said. "Let us pay it, Ms. Briggs. Please." She looked at her car, at this man she had known for approximately 4 hours, at the impossible kindness being offered in a cold parking lot on a December night. "Okay," she said quietly. Garrett nodded. "I'll be here first thing." She drove home slowly, the loose heat shield rattling gently beneath her, and she thought about Wade, about what he had done on that road in Iraq that he had never described to her, about the way he had said once that he was glad she had not been there to see it, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew she would have been frightened for him, and he did not want her frightened. He had run 200 meters through enemy fire to pull a stranger out of a burning vehicle, and he had never mentioned it. She put her hand on her belly at a red light. "Your daddy was something else," she said. The baby rolled a slow and certain movement, and she drove the rest of the way home in a quiet that felt, for the first time in many months, less like emptiness and more like peace. The morning rush at Harlan's Fork on a day in mid-December had a different quality than it had the week before. Not louder, not more crowded, but changed in the particular way that rooms change when something has happened in them. The regulars came in and they sat in their usual spots, and they ordered their usual things, but they moved a little differently, a little more deliberately, as though they were conscious of the space around them, in a way they had not been before the Wednesday, when a man in a gray suit had grabbed a waitress's wrist and the room had stood up. Tommy Benton, who ran the hardware store 2 doors down, came in at his usual 7:15 and sat at the counter and ordered his usual eggs and coffee, and looked at Pearl when she poured for him with an expression that was careful and direct. "You holding up okay?" he said. Pearl set down the pot. "Better than yesterday," she said. "Better than last week." Tommy nodded. He had been recording on his phone before most people in the room had processed what was happening. He had a construction worker's instinct, she thought, the habit of noticing when something was structurally wrong and acting before the analysis was complete. Those videos are at 500,000 now, he said. Nashville station called me last night asking if I'd give a statement. What did you say? Said I'd think about it. He looked into his coffee. You mind if I do? Pearl shook her head. Say whatever you need to say. It's what you saw. He nodded, poured a little cream in the coffee and stirred it. Then he said without looking up, my wife's family is from over near Cookville. Hargrove's got rental properties over there too. She had a cousin who couldn't get heat fixed in the middle of February because he owns the building and nobody could make him do anything. He finally just moved. Pearl looked at him. I guess what I'm saying is it's not just about you, Tommy said. It never is with guys like that. I know, Pearl said. That's what makes it matter. She refilled his coffee and moved to the next customer, and the morning went on in the way mornings go, when they are carrying something larger than themselves, ordinary and unremarkable on the surface, and full of consequence underneath. At 10 o'clock, while the breakfast crowd was thinning and Eddie was restocking the griddle, Hazel called Pearl to the counter. Those boys from the motel want to talk to you, Hazel said. Vance and the one with the dark eyes. Dalton. Pearl found them at the corner booth, the same booth from the day before, and she slid in across from them with a mug of coffee she did not particularly want and held it for something to do with her hands. We've been doing some research, Vance said. He pushed the folder across the table the way he had pushed the other folder, the accident report folder, but the quality of his face was different. Less grim, more considered. What kind of research? Dalton answered. The kind that tells us about a person's exposure. What they own, who they answer to, what they stand to lose. Pearl looked at the papers, property records she could tell from the format, county filings. Hargrove owns 41 properties in this county, Dalton said. 32 residential. He controls a significant portion of the rental market, and he has done so through a structure designed to be opaque. Shell companies, nominee officers, staggered ownership chains. It takes patience to unravel it, but it unravels. Why are you showing me this? Because you should understand what you're dealing with, Vance said. Not to scare you, to show you that what seems like an impenetrable position always has pressure points. He has a lot to protect. That means he has a lot to lose. And men who have a lot to lose can be moved if you apply the right kind of pressure in the right places. Pearl looked at the papers for a moment. She thought about the eviction notice in her apartment. She thought about the yellow kitchen she had painted with Wade and the specific weight of the eviction notice on the counter. What are the right places, she asked. The public record, Vance said. A journalist, the county prosecutor, the 4 other women we've heard about who've had their own experiences with him. You've heard about them. Hazel has, Dalton said. She's been careful about who she talks to, but she knows, and they know her. Pearl sat with the information for a moment. She was very tired. She had been very tired for 16 months. But there was a specific quality to this tiredness that was different from the exhaustion that came from grief, which was passive, and from the exhaustion that came from working double shifts, which was physical. This was the tiredness of someone being asked to do something large, and it had in it the particular weight of things that matter. Okay, she said, what do you need from me? Your trust, Vance said, and your patience, and the understanding that this will take time and it will not be easy, and there will be days when it feels like it's going wrong. He looked at her steadily. Can you do that? Pearl held the coffee mug. Outside the window, Route 7 was carrying its ordinary traffic trucks and cars and the slow rhythms of a small county going about its business. I have been doing hard things alone for 16 months, she said. Yes, I can do hard things with people helping me. Vance nodded. Then let's get to work. They left the booth. Pearl watched them go to the parking lot, where Garrett was still working on her car, the hood up, and his thermos sitting on the fender and the radio playing. She watched Vance stop and speak to Garrett briefly, and Garrett nod without looking up from what he was doing, the nod of a man who had already decided and was simply confirming the decision. She thought about Wade, about the way he used to say when something complicated was sitting on the table between them, and she was working out whether to be afraid of it. Start with what you know. Start there and move outward. You can navigate anything if you do it one step at a time. She picked up the coffee pot and walked to the next table, one step at a time. The morning after the slap, Pearl woke at 5:30 as she always did. opened her eyes to the familiar ceiling, and lay still for a moment before sitting up. The routine had not changed. The crack above the light fixture was still there. The water stain was still there. The eviction notice was still on the kitchen counter, 9 days old and counting. But something was different. She could not have named it precisely, but it had the quality of a door that had been closed for a long time, standing slightly ajar, just enough to let through a thread of something new. She dressed and walked to the diner. Garrett's truck was already in the lot, parked beside her Civic. He had the hood up and a portable work light rigged from the truck's exterior hook, and he was elbow deep in the engine, with the focused stillness of someone who had made peace with early mornings long ago. "Ms. Briggs," he said when he heard her footsteps without looking up. "You were here before 6, Pearl said. "Always start early. Light's better before the sun's all the way up." It was overcast. The light was identical to what it would be at noon, flat and gray and diffuse. She looked at him for a moment. He had a transistor radio on the hood playing low-country music and a thermos of coffee beside it. He was a man entirely at ease with himself and his work in the early morning of a winter day, and there was something about that which Pearl found unexpectedly comforting. "Coffee's in the thermos if you want some," he said. "Extra cup in the cab." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in more than one direction. Inside the diner, Hazel had the griddle going. Brooks Keller came in at 7:30 with a folder of papers, sat at the counter with coffee, and waited until there was a lull between the breakfast crowd before he called Pearl over. "Dr. Wynn at the Nashville V.A. will see you Friday," he said. "I have taken the liberty of pulling together your paperwork and noting what you'll need to bring." He slid the folder across the counter. "You qualify for full prenatal coverage through the VA system. No cost. You also qualify for monthly survivor support as a surviving dependent spouse. About $1,200 a month. There may be additional housing assistance." Pearl looked at the folder. She had known in the abstract way of knowing something you have been too overwhelmed to act on that benefits existed. She had not known the specifics. $1,200 a month was the difference between barely surviving and having something like margin. "Why haven't I been getting it?" she asked. "Because you haven't applied," Brooks said without judgment. "The system doesn't come to you. You have to go to it. And right after a loss, most people don't have the bandwidth to navigate the paperwork. That is not a failing. That is just how it works." Pearl looked at the folder for a moment. Then she looked at Brooks, at his steady professional face. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me after the appointment." At 9, Vance and Dalton drove to the Whitfield County Administrative Building and spent 2 hours in the records office. The clerk there was a woman named Ruth Alderman, who had been employed by the county for 23 years and had developed a particular relationship with the public documents in her care, something adjacent to pride in her ability to find things. She looked at them when they came in and made the quick assessment that people who process strangers for a living make automatically. "Help you," she said. "We're looking for everything public on a Dean Hargrove," Vance said. "Property records, business filings, anything of record in this county." Ruth looked at him. Then she said, "You're not the first people to ask about him this month." "We won't be the last," Dalton said. She studied him. Then she turned to her computer. What she showed them over the next 90 minutes was not surprising in its individual elements, but was illuminating in its totality. Dean Hargrove owned through a network of 6 LLCs, with names designed to be as unremarkable as possible, 41 properties in Whitfield County. 32 were residential rental units. 6 were commercial spaces. 3 were vacant lots in areas where the county planning board on which Hargrove served had recently approved new zoning that substantially increased their value. Dalton photographed everything with his phone, working systematically. He had been a signals intelligence specialist in the Marines, and the discipline of that work had given him a methodical relationship with information, the habit of documenting completely, and organizing logically before drawing conclusions. Then Ruth said without looking up from her screen, "There's something else." She pulled up a different database. "This is the Motor Vehicle Records Department. Not usually our business here, but when you have been in this office as long as I have, you know where things connect." She turned the monitor toward them. It was an accident report. July 14th of the previous year. Route 7 outside Millhaven. Involved vehicles: a black Ford F-150 registered to Millstream Properties, LLC, and a silver Tacoma registered to a private individual. Dalton leaned in. Millstream Properties. That's one of Hargrove's entities, yes, Ruth said. The F-150 driver was a Terry Boggs listed as an employee of Hargrove Construction Services. DUI. He pled guilty to manslaughter 2 months after the accident, sentenced to 4 years. Vance was very still. The driver of the Tacoma, Ruth said. Name on the report is Wade Allen Briggs. The records office was quiet. A distant phone rang somewhere down the hall. The fluorescent light above the filing cabinet hummed. Dalton looked at Vance. Vance looked at the report. Then he looked at Ruth. The Boggs plea deal, he said. Was it fast? Ruth's expression was carefully neutral. Plea was entered 6 weeks after the accident. That is on the faster end for a manslaughter case, yes. Representation. She typed for a moment. Defense counsel was a Robert Carey of Carey and Associates, Knoxville. She paused. Mr. Carey represents several of Hargrove's business entities and other matters on record here. Vance looked at the report for a long moment. He took a breath. I need copies of all of this, he said. Ruth printed the pages and handed them across the counter. You didn't get these from me, she said. Then she paused. Whatever you're planning, be careful. Hargrove has had this county a long time. Vance nodded. Thank you, ma'am. He and Dalton walked out into the gray December morning and sat in the truck for a moment without speaking. He covered it up, Dalton said. He paid to cover it up, Vance said. He got Boggs a lawyer, got the case moved fast, got it closed before anyone could look too carefully at the connection to his company. He looked at the papers in his hand. Wade didn't just die, he was killed. And the man responsible for the vehicle that killed him walked away clean. Dalton was quiet. Does Pearl know, he asked. She knows what the court record shows. A DUI manslaughter, a drunk driver, a conviction. She doesn't know about the connection to Hargrove or the attorney or the speed of the plea. She needs to know. Yes, Vance said. She does, but we do it right. We have everything documented first. We have a complete picture before we put this in front of her. He folded the papers carefully, because when she finds out it's going to hit her hard, and we need to be ready to stand in it with her. They drove back to the diner. Pearl was in the middle of her lunch shift when Vance arrived. He waited drinking coffee at the counter until the rush thinned. Then he asked Hazel if there was somewhere private they could all talk. Hazel took over Pearl's tables without ceremony and led them to the back room, the small space with the table and the chairs and the refrigerator that hummed too loud. Pearl came in and saw Vance and Dalton in the folder on the table, and something in their faces told her that what was coming was not small. She sat down. Vance set the pages in front of her without preamble. These are public records from the county administrative office, he said. You need to look at them. Take your time. Pearl looked at the top page, the accident report. She had seen a version of it before the official report filed with the insurance company, but that version had not included the registered owner of the vehicle. This one did. She read it, then she read it again. Millstream Properties, LLC, she said. We cross-referenced the registered agents, Dalton said quietly. Millstream Properties is owned by Hargrove Development Holdings, which is a subsidiary of Hargrove Enterprises, LLC, which is registered to Dean Hargrove as sole managing member. Pearl was looking at the page. Her face was very still. The defense attorney, Vance said, Robert Carey. He represents Hargrove's businesses in other county filings. The representation on the Boggs case appears to have been coordinated, and the plea was entered 6 weeks after the accident. She was not looking at the pages anymore. She was looking at the middle distance, the way people look when they are processing something that is reordering their understanding of a past they thought they had come to terms with. He knew, Pearl said. Her voice was flat and quiet. He knew whose car it was. He paid for the lawyer. He made sure it moved fast before anyone could look at the connection. We believe so, Vance said. We're not lawyers. These are public records and reasonable inferences. But yes. Pearl pressed both hands flat on the table. Then she stood up slowly and walked to the window. It looked out onto the alley behind the diner, a narrow strip of concrete with a dumpster and stacked cardboard boxes. For a long moment, she stood there. Then she said very quietly, He came into this diner yesterday. He grabbed my wrist and he hit me. And the whole time he already knew. He already knew what his company did to Wade. Vance did not answer because the statement did not require an answer. Pearl turned around. There were no tears now. The thing that had replaced them was harder and steadier and more purposeful. "What do we do with this?" she asked. Vance looked at her. "It's your choice," he said. "All of it. You can file a civil action against Hargrove Properties for the accident. You can bring this to the county prosecutor. You can share it with a journalist. Any or all of those things. But you have an opinion. I have an opinion that men who do what he has done should face the consequences of it, and that you have more tools in your hands right now than you know." Pearl looked at the folder. Then she looked at Vance. "I'm going to need help," she said. "You've got it." That afternoon, Brooks drove Pearl to a meeting at the Nashville VA hospital to see Dr. Wynn. The drive took 40 minutes and they spent most of it in comfortable, near silence, the kind that settles between people who understand that not every moment requires filling. Dr. Margaret Wynn was 43, efficient and warm, in a combination that Pearl found immediately trustworthy. She reviewed Pearl's situation with the focused attention of someone who had guided many people through exactly this kind of navigation. "You should have been receiving support from the first month," Dr. Wynn said. "I didn't know." "Nobody tells you," the doctor said. "It is one of the consistent failures of the system." She pulled up forms on her screen. "We are going to fix that today. I'm enrolling you in the VA prenatal program, effective immediately. Full coverage for all remaining appointments, delivery, and postpartum care. I'm also initiating your application for survivor-dependent benefits, which will take 4 to 6 weeks to process, but will be retroactively applied." "How much?" "$1,240 a month once approved," Dr. Wynn said. "Given your circumstances, I am flagging this for expedited review. You may see it in 3 weeks." Pearl looked at her hands in her lap. $1,200 a month retroactively applied from the date of Wade's death would mean she had already earned a substantial sum that had been sitting in a government account waiting for her to claim it. She signed what needed signing and drove back to Millhaven with Brooks in the fading afternoon light, feeling something she had not felt in many months. She had footing. Not solid ground yet, not the feeling of safety, but the beginning of footing, a place to push from. Two things happened in the following days that changed the shape of the situation. The first was the envelope under Pearl's door on Thursday morning. Inside was a check for $14,000. The memo line read, "Iron Road Veterans Relief Fund Survivor Support. No name, no return address." Pearl stared at it for a long time. She called Hazel. "Did you have anything to do with this?" Hazel was quiet for a moment. "Those boys came through for you, honey. It's too much." "It is exactly enough. Pearl, let yourself be helped." Pearl sat on the edge of her bed with the check in her hand. The baby rolled beneath her palm, his morning greeting. She deposited the check that afternoon, paid the back rent, caught up on the IVF clinic payment plan, watched the numbers in her bank account shift from the red end of the spectrum to a place that did not make her feel sick when she looked at it. It was like being able to breathe again after a long time at altitude. The second thing that happened was Dean Hargrove's response. She had known it was coming. Vance had told her men like Hargrove do not absorb a public embarrassment without response. The videos had been spreading since Wednesday afternoon, 4 different angles from 4 different phones. The 32-second clip of a well-dressed man grabbing a pregnant waitress's wrist and striking her across the face when she asked him to stop. By Thursday morning, they had 70,000 combined views. By Friday morning, they had 300,000. A Nashville news affiliate had picked up the story and run a segment. 2 national aggregators had shared it. Dean Hargrove woke Friday to a situation he had not encountered in 20 years, which was public accountability. On Friday afternoon, Pearl arrived home to find a new notice on her door. Not from her existing landlord. This one was on letterhead for Millstream Residential Holdings, LLC, notifying her that the building had been acquired and that her month-to-month tenancy was being terminated effective 72 hours from the date of notice. She had paid her back rent 48 hours earlier. She sat down on the apartment steps in the cold afternoon and looked at the notice. Then she called Vance. "He's evicting me," she said. "I paid the rent 2 days ago, and he bought the building, and he's evicting me." Vance was quiet for 3 seconds. "Where are you right now?" "Front steps of my building." "Stay there. I'm coming." He arrived in 20 minutes with all 5 brothers. They stood in her small apartment, these 6 men with their leather vests and their road-worn faces, and they listened without interrupting while she explained. Vance's jaw was tight. Retaliatory eviction. illegal in Tennessee. I know, Pearl said, but by the time I could prove it in court, I'd be out on the street, Silas Vance said. Silas Donovan was already nodding. The church apartment, he said. It's used for visiting missionaries during revivals, but it's empty right now. 2 bedrooms, full kitchen, working heat. $1 a month rent until you're back on your feet. Pearl started to say something, and Vance held up a hand. Not charity, he said. Emergency housing for a veteran's widow during a retaliatory housing action. That is what it is. She looked at them. At these men who had walked into her life 3 days ago and had in the space of 72 hours addressed more of her immediate crises than she had been able to address in 16 months. The baby moved. Okay, she said. They moved her that afternoon. It took 3 hours. Everything Pearl owned fit in Garrett's truck in Decker's van. They assembled her bed, placed her furniture, put her kitchen in order. When she arrived after her dinner shift, the apartment was ready, warm and clean, with a note on the kitchen table from Reverend Silas that said, "Welcome home." She stood in the empty living room and pressed her hand to her belly and allowed herself to feel it, the safety of walls around her that did not belong to Dean Hargrove. But Hargrove was not finished. The following Monday brought 3 simultaneous actions that Vance recognized as the coordinated response of a man who understood leverage and was applying all of it at once. The first was a surprise inspection of Harlan's Fork by the county health department. The inspector arrived at 8 in the morning and found by the end of his 2-hour visit 7 violations. All of them were minor, all were fixable, and all had the particular quality of things that would be present in virtually any working commercial kitchen if examined closely enough with the intention of finding something wrong. Hazel recognized what they were and called Vance with her jaw set. "He's using the county apparatus to pressure you," Vance said. "I know what he's doing. The question is what we do about it. Can you fix the violations? Eddie and I can fix them in a day if we have the materials. But the reinspection fee is $300 and something always surfaces in a reinspection. He'll keep the diner tied up in inspection cycles for months. How much to fix everything properly and get ahead of it?" Hazel was quiet, maybe $2,500. "I'll cover it," Vance said. Hazel said, "I'm not taking that." "You're not taking anything. I'm paying a debt. Will you let me pay it or not?" A pause. "Yes, fine, thank you." The second action was a fraudulent insurance claim filed against Harlan's Fork by a person who stated they had been injured on the premises. The claim was for $6,000 for a back injury allegedly sustained in a slip and fall. There was no incident report, no date of injury, no witness, just the claim. Third, on Monday afternoon, Vance received a call from a number he did not recognize. "Mr. Holden," the voice said. "My name is Robert Carey. I represent Dean Hargrove." Vance recognized the name from the accident report files. He said nothing and let the silence work. "Mr. Hargrove would like to resolve the situation amicably," Carey said. "He is prepared to offer a settlement to Ms. Briggs of $50,000 in exchange for a full release of all civil claims arising from the incident at the diner, as well as a confidentiality agreement covering all related matters." Vance was quiet for a moment. "You mean he wants her to sign something saying she won't talk about the accident?" The scope of the confidentiality agreement would be discussed during negotiations. "The answer is no," Vance said. "Mr. Holden, I would encourage you to reconsider. Mr. Hargrove is a significant presence in this county. He has resources and connections that would make a protracted legal process quite difficult for all parties." "Tell your client something for me," Vance said. "The answer to this offer is no. If he makes another move against Pearl Briggs or Hazel Carver or anyone who helped them, those property records and that accident report go to every journalist in the state of Tennessee by end of business that same day. Make sure he understands that is not a threat. It is a timeline." He hung up. Dalton was sitting across from him in the motel room. He looked at Vance with the expression of someone reassessing a situation. "That might make it worse before it gets better," Dalton said. "It might, but men like Hargrove read yielding as invitation. If we yield now, he escalates. If we push back, he either escalates harder or he cuts his losses. Either way, we know where we stand." That evening, Hazel called a meeting. Pearl Vance and the 5 Iron Road brothers gathered in the back room of Harlan's Fork after closing. Hazel made coffee and set out pecan pie, and they sat around the crowded table in the yellow light and talked about what they had and what they were going to do with it. We have the videos, Vance said. 4 clean angles, multiple witnesses, police report. We have the property records showing Hargrove's holdings and the eviction timeline. We have the accident report and the connection between Hargrove Properties and the vehicle that killed Wade. We have testimony that could be gathered. What do we do with it? Hazel said. We give it to someone who can make it matter. Vance looked at his brothers. Dalton, you know how to build a document package. Dalton nodded. We need a narrative, a timeline, primary sources attached. Something a journalist or a prosecutor can follow without having to dig. I know a reporter, Brooks said. Jennifer Slater at the Nashville Tribune. She covers veteran issues. She is good, she is careful, and she has a track record of not burning sources. Caller Vance said. That same evening at the church apartment, Pearl sat in the small living room after the meeting and held the things she had been given over the past few days, not just the check and the car and the housing, but the weight of what she now knew about Wade's death. The weight of knowing it had not been a random terrible thing, but a specific terrible thing connected to a specific person who had been in her diner the day before, who had grabbed her wrist and hit her face and smiled at her. She did not cry. She had done her crying for the day. What she felt instead was a cold and quiet clarity, the kind that comes after grief has burned through its first phase and left something harder behind. She reached under the bed and pulled out the journal. Wade's journal, the one she had been too afraid to open for 16 months. She had moved it from the apartment in its same shoebox without unpacking. It had put it under the bed in the new room without being able to make herself look at it. She opened it. She started at the beginning, the training entries from before his first deployment. Ordinary and earnest, a young man trying to explain what he was doing and why. She read forward through the months, through the deployments, in the homecoming, in the years of ordinary life that followed. She read about herself, which was something she had not expected. He had written about her with the plain directness he applied to everything. August 12th, 2009. Met a woman today at the base clinic. Pearl. She smiled at me and I forgot what I was saying. I think about her all the time now. I don't know what to do with that. She pressed the page against her chest for a moment. Then she kept reading. Near the back of the journal, she found what she had not known she was looking for. November 19th, 2007. His handwriting was smaller than usual, slightly less even the handwriting of someone writing quickly and under physical or emotional pressure. We were on a supply run today when the second Humvee hit an IED. It flipped. I could see it from the road ahead, saw it go over and catch fire. Rounds were still coming in. I ran. I don't know what I was thinking. I was thinking about the guys inside. I got to the vehicle and there was a sergeant trapped in the back seat, burns on his arm unconscious. I got the door, it wouldn't open. I got the rear window instead. Pulled him out. His gear weighed a ton. I don't remember the distance back to cover. I remember setting him down and checking his breathing and somebody pulling me sideways because I had a crease on my left shoulder I hadn't felt yet. He was breathing. They got him on the bird. I don't know his name. I hope he made it. Pearl stopped reading. She read the entry again. I hope somebody does the same for my family if something happens to me, Wade had written below it. That's all I ever ask. She sat with the journal open in her lap for a long time looking at her husband's handwriting. Then she called Vance. He answered on the second ring, immediately alert. Pearl. I found something, she said. In his journal. The night of November 19th, 2007. He wrote about pulling a sergeant out of a burning vehicle. He didn't know your name. Vance was quiet. He wrote that he hoped somebody would do the same for his family, Pearl said. She kept her voice steady. That was his exact hope. Written down. Vance said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than it had been. Will you read me the entry? She read it to him. All of it. The small handwriting and the uncertain cadence, the last line. Vance did not speak for a while after she finished. She heard him breathe. Thank you for that, he said finally. That's thank you. I thought you should hear it, Pearl said. From him, not from me. Yes. They sat with the phone open between them for a moment. Get some sleep, Vance said. I'll see you tomorrow. She closed the journal and put it on the nightstand beside the photograph. Wade in his dress blues, 28 and smiling. She touched the frame with 2 fingers. I think you knew, she said to the empty room. I think somehow you knew it would work out. She turned off the light. The baby moved slow and certain. She slept. The following Tuesday, 4 women walked into the Whitfield County Sheriff's Office within a 2-hour window and filed separate reports. Rose Farley, a teacher at Millhaven Elementary, who said Hargrove had grabbed her arm in the parking lot of his car dealership in 2020 and refused to release her when she asked him to stop. Connie Decker, a bank teller who said Hargrove had cornered her in a parking structure in 2022 and made explicit statements she had been too frightened to report at the time. Laurel Haynes, a paralegal at a county law firm, who said Hargrove had done something similar at a county planning board social function the previous year. And Nora Aldridge, a waitress at a diner in the neighboring county, who said Hargrove had habitually harassed her during his visits over a period of 2 years. All 4 had seen the videos. All 4 had been in contact with Hazel Carver, who had made careful, quiet phone calls over the previous 3 days. All 4 had decided that if Pearl Briggs could stand up in a room full of witnesses and say, "Please let go of me," they could walk into a police station and file a report. Chief Whitfield took the reports with the expression of a man who had just realized the mathematics of his situation had changed significantly. He could not ignore 4 separate complainants, not with the videos already public, not with a news cycle that had picked up the story and was not letting it go. Deputy Reeves, who was not unaware of what was happening, watched the chief make the call to the prosecutor's office from across the room, and something in the deputy's expression that had been carefully managed for several days became for just a moment less carefully managed. Jennifer Slater from the Nashville Tribune arrived in Millhaven on Wednesday morning and spent 6 hours at Harlan's Fork talking to Pearl and Hazel and several of the regular customers who had been present on the day of the incident. She was thorough and patient and asked questions that moved between the immediate events and the larger context with the precision of someone who understood that the specific and the systemic were 2 parts of the same story. Her article ran in the Tribune on Thursday morning. The headline read, "Developer Charged with Assault After Striking Pregnant Widow. Records link company vehicle to her husband's fatal accident." The article was thorough. It covered the incident at the diner, the videos, the eviction, the health inspection, the fraudulent insurance claim. It covered the accident report and the connection between Hargrove Properties and the vehicle driven by Terry Boggs. It covered the 4 women who had filed reports. It included a statement from Pearl. "He came into that diner knowing what his company had done to my husband," Pearl had said. "He sat down at a table in a place where I work, and he tested to see what I would tolerate. And when I asked him to stop, he hit me. I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for every person in this county who has experienced something they were too afraid to report because he seemed untouchable. He is not untouchable." Dean Hargrove woke Thursday morning to find his face on the front page of a major regional newspaper and his phone recording more incoming calls than he had received on any single previous day. By noon, 2 of his business partners had issued statements of distance. The county planning board announced it was placing his seat under review pending the outcome of the investigation. A protest had formed outside his car dealership on Route 7, not large, maybe 30 people, but visible and persistent. His lawyer called Pearl's phone that afternoon with a revised settlement offer, $200,000, expanded confidentiality provisions. Vance was sitting across from Pearl when the call came in. He watched her face as she listened. She looked at him. She looked at the phone. "No," she said into the phone. Then she hung up. The December light was going outside the church apartment windows, the sky turning the blue-gray of a Tennessee winter evening. Pearl set the phone down on the table and sat with her hands folded in front of her. "We go to trial," she said. "All of it. The slap and the eviction and the accident, all of it on record." Vance nodded. "Will you be there?" "Every day," Vance said. "All of us," Dalton said from the doorway. Pearl looked at each of them. These men who had become in the space of a week something she did not have a word for. Not family, not exactly, but something built from the same materials. "Okay," she said, "then let's do it." The preliminary hearing was set for the following Tuesday. Hargrove arrived at the Whitfield County Courthouse with 3 lawyers and the ease of a man who had been in courtrooms before and found them manageable. He wore a different suit, this one charcoal with a faint pinstripe, and he moved through the courthouse hallway with the same controlled pleasantness. Pearl arrived with Vance on one side and Hazel on the other, and behind them the other 5 Iron Road brothers in their leather vests. They sat in the second row behind the prosecution table and waited. Judge Patricia Shaw reviewed the charges, set a trial date for 6 weeks hence, and issued a protective order requiring Hargrove to maintain a minimum of 500 feet from Pearl Briggs and from Harlan's Fork Diner. Hargrove's lead attorney objected on 2 grounds. Judge Shaw listened and issued the order anyway. As they left the courthouse, Hargrove's lawyer appeared beside Pearl with the smooth, materializing quality of someone who had learned to approach people from the peripheral angle. "Ms. Briggs," he said, "Mr. Hargrove genuinely regrets what happened. He is prepared to be generous. This does not need to go to trial." Pearl stopped. Vance stopped immediately beside her. Jennifer Slater was standing 20 feet away with a notebook. "My answer is no," Pearl said at a volume that carried clearly to the reporter. "To any offer. I'll see him in court." The lawyer absorbed the refusal with professional composure. Pearl walked to the car. Jennifer Slater wrote it down. That evening, Pearl sat at the kitchen table in the church apartment and wrote a letter addressed to the Whitfield County Prosecutor's Office. It enclosed copies of the documents Vance and Dalton had obtained organized chronologically, with a cover memo explaining the connection between Hargrove Properties and the vehicle that had killed Wade. It requested that the prosecutor's office open a separate investigation into the circumstances of the accident and the subsequent plea arrangement. She signed it, put it in a manila envelope, and set it on the counter to mail in the morning. Then she sat for a while in the quiet apartment, the baby rolling gently against her ribs, and thought about Wade, about what it meant that his one written hope had been exactly this, that someone would come through for his family the way he had come through for strangers. She was not as afraid as she had been on the morning 16 days ago, when she had lain in bed looking at the ceiling crack and felt the weight of everything pressing her down like water above a swimmer. Something had shifted. Not the circumstances themselves, not entirely, but the quality of the ground under her, the sense of it being solid enough to push from. She got up and washed her face and went to bed. In the morning there would be work, and the trial was coming, and the baby was moving through his own slow calendar toward the day he would arrive. Whatever came, she would meet it. She had been meeting it for 16 months. She had just been doing it alone, which was the part that was going to change. The week before the trial, Vance drove to Murfreesboro on a Thursday morning to visit Terry Boggs. It had been Dalton's idea. Boggs was serving his sentence at a minimum security facility. Dalton had found through the channels available to someone with his intelligence background that Boggs had been passed over for early parole twice. The parole denials had come during a period when Hargrove's attorney had been in contact with the parole board. Vance sat across a visitation table from Terry Boggs, who was thinner than his booking photo, with the contracted quality of someone who had spent too long in a space that was not large enough. "I'm not here to threaten you or offer you anything," Vance said. "I'm here because the man whose truck your company put you in killed a Marine named Wade Briggs on Route 7 16 months ago, and his widow is about to go to trial against Hargrove. And I want to know if there is anything you want to say about the circumstances of your representation." Boggs was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know it was his truck," he said finally. "The company truck? I thought it was just a DUI case. How did you find out it was Hargrove's vehicle?" Boggs looked at the table. "He said he'd take care of my family while I was in. My wife, my kids. Said the lawyer would make sure I got the minimum." He paused. "The lawyer got me the minimum. My wife got checks for 6 months, then they stopped." Vance looked at him. "Would you be willing to say that in court?" Long silence. "What do I get?" "I can't offer you anything official," Vance said. "But if you testify truthfully, there's an attorney in Nashville who does pro bono work for people seeking parole review. I can give you his name." Boggs studied him. "Hargrove said if I ever said anything about the arrangement, he'd make sure I served every day of the sentence. He's got connections to the parole board." "I know he does," Vance said. "What I'm asking you is whether the fact that he's facing a trial and a state investigation changes your calculation." Another long silence. "If he goes down anyway," Boggs said slowly, "then his connections don't mean anything anymore." "That's right," Vance said. "Get me the attorney's name," he said. Vance drove back to Millhaven through the bare November countryside, the highway unspooling ahead of him, with enough space to think. He had been on roads like this 1,000 times, the long, empty stretches where the thing you had been turning over in your mind had room to settle. He thought about Terry Boggs sitting at that table, his hands flat on the surface, the way people put their hands flat on surfaces when they are trying to hold themselves steady. A man who had made a bad decision and carried it for 16 months in a facility that gave him little else to do with it, who had agreed to say what he had done and what had been done to him. It was not courage in the theatrical sense. It was just a man who had decided that the weight of silence had exceeded the weight of speaking. He thought about Pearl. He thought about what he would tell Wade Vance Briggs someday when the boy was old enough to understand. About what kind of man his father had been, and about what that man's choices made in a single unremarkable moment on a road outside Fallujah had set in motion across 17 years. He drove back to Mill Haven with the attorney's name in his phone contacts and a meeting scheduled between the attorney and Boggs for the following Monday. He did not tell Pearl about the meeting until it was confirmed. He had learned in the space of these weeks that Pearl Briggs did not respond well to information provided before it was reliable, that she needed what was real and not what was possible, and that respecting that about her was part of respecting her. When he told her sitting across from her at the kitchen table in the church apartment, with mugs of tea cooling between them, she sat with the information for several minutes without speaking. "He covered it up," she said, "and then he walked into my diner." "He did," Vance said. She nodded once slowly, the nod of someone filing something away in a particular place. "When does the trial start?" she asked. "Monday," Vance said. "7 days," Pearl said. She looked at her tea. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him with the clear, level gaze that he had come to understand was her natural expression when she had decided something. "Then we're ready," she said. There were things Pearl was afraid of as the trial approached. She was afraid of the way Hargrove's lawyers would try to reshape what had happened, to reframe the slap as a misunderstanding to make her the unreliable narrator of her own experience. She was afraid of standing in front of a jury and being seen, really seen in all her particularity, a young widow 7 months pregnant working a double shift in a small-town diner and having that particularity work against her rather than for her. She was afraid more quietly of what the state investigation into the accident might uncover. Not because she doubted that Hargrove had covered something up, but because some truths are clarifying, and some truths add weight to weight you are already carrying. And she did not know yet which kind this would be. But she went to work. She went every day, and she poured the coffee, and she remembered the orders, and she smiled at the regular customers, and she let the rhythm of the diner hold her the way it had always held her. The familiar choreography of a job she was good at, the specific comfort of competence. Hazel watched her. Hazel always watched her. One afternoon, about 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, Hazel sat down across from Pearl in the corner booth during the mid-afternoon lull and looked at her with the expression she wore when she was going to say something she had been holding back. "You don't have to be brave all the time," Hazel said. "Not in here. Not with me." Pearl looked at her coffee. "I know," she said. "Do you?" Pearl was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck pulled into the lot and idled for a moment, and then pulled back out, having changed its mind about something. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," Pearl said finally. "I know what I felt when I read that journal entry. I know what I feel when I think about Wade writing that down, that hope, and not knowing that the answer was already 17 years in motion." She paused. "Mostly, I just feel like I can't afford to feel it yet. Like I have to get through the trial first, and then I'll let myself feel what it means." Hazel looked at her with the steady attention she had given to 1,000 difficult things across 32 years behind this counter. "James used to say that," Hazel said. "My husband, he was a Korean War vet, came home with things he didn't know how to put down and spent a long time telling himself he'd deal with them when the timing was better." She paused. "The timing is never better. It's just different." Pearl considered that. "I know," she said, "but the baby is coming and the trial is coming, and I need to be able to function through both. After that, I'll let it in all the way." Hazel reached across the table and covered Pearl's hand with hers for a moment, not saying anything, just covering it. That was Hazel. That had always been Hazel. In the evenings after her shifts, Pearl had taken to walking before she went to the church apartment. Not long walks, not in the December cold, and not at 8 months pregnant, but short, purposeful ones around the block and down to the corner and back, the kind that gave her body something to do while her mind did the larger work it needed to do. On one of these evenings, she passed a woman she recognized from the grocery store, a woman named Caroline who had a son in the National Guard and who always asked after Pearl with the specific warmth of someone who understood at least a portion of what military family life felt like. They stopped on the sidewalk for a moment, their breath making small clouds in the cold. "I saw those videos," Caroline said. "Everyone did." Pearl nodded. "I want you to know," Caroline said, "that there are a lot of people in this town who have been waiting for someone to say what you said. That is not okay. What he did, what he has done." She paused. "People have been afraid to say it because of who he is. But after the videos, after your statement outside the police station," she shook her head, "people are talking, really talking." Pearl looked at her. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. She walked the rest of the way home thinking about what Caroline had said, about the way fear works in communities, the way a single person's visible courage can shift the temperature of a room, can make other people's courage possible. She had not set out to do that. She had simply asked a man to let go of her wrist and stood still when he did not. But the effect of it had moved outward in ways she was only beginning to understand. She let herself into the church apartment and sat at the kitchen table for a while before bed, not reading, not looking at her phone, just sitting with the quiet, which had a different quality now than it had 2 weeks ago. Less like emptiness, more like the pause before something. Outside, the December night settled over Millhaven, and in the diner on Route 7 and Mill Road, the lights were off and the chairs were up on the tables, and the bronze plaque that was not yet there would be there in 8 months, and Wade Vance Briggs, who was not yet born, would arrive in 4 weeks, and the trial that would change the county was 2 weeks away. Pearl put her hand on her belly and felt him move that slow, certain roll that was his and no one else's. "We're almost through it," she told him. "Just a little further." She went to bed. She slept. The trial began on a Monday in January when the Tennessee sky was the color of old pewter, and the courthouse parking lot had a thin skim of ice that crunched underfoot. Pearl arrived early before the galleries opened and sat in the cold with Hazel outside the building's main entrance, not talking, just present with each other in the way of people who have said what needs saying and are now simply accompanying each other through what comes next. Vance and the others arrived at 7:30, the six of them walking across the icy lot in a loose group that parted naturally around obstacles and reformed without effort. They wore their vests. Nobody had suggested they shouldn't. The courtroom was the largest in the Whitfield County building, a high-ceilinged room with wood paneling installed in the early 1980s and not updated since. It held about 150 people in the gallery, and it was full by the time Judge Patricia Shaw entered. Judge Shaw was a careful woman who ran her court with the precise efficiency of someone who had no patience for theater and no tolerance for waste. She had reviewed the evidence package before the trial began, and her expression, which was professional and entirely neutral, nevertheless had a quality that Pearl noticed when she entered, the quality of someone who had already formed a view and was waiting for the testimony to either confirm or challenge it. The prosecution was represented by Assistant County Prosecutor Dana Mills, 41, who had been in that office for 12 years and had the reputation of a methodical and thorough lawyer who rarely lost when she believed in the case. She believed in this one. Hargrove's defense team was 3 attorneys from a Nashville firm that specialized in corporate and civil litigation and had less experience with criminal defense than their suits suggested. They were competent and expensive, and they had been given a difficult case that the video evidence had already substantially shaped before the first witness took the stand. The first day covered the incident itself. The prosecution played all 4 videos. 32 seconds of Dean Hargrove sitting in a diner booth, reaching across the table and closing his hand around the wrist of a woman who was trying to leave, and then backhanding her across the face when she asked him to stop. The jury watched it 4 times. Their faces did not require interpretation. The 4 women testified on the second day. Rose Farley, steady and precise. Connie Decker, who had been frightened when she came in, and who was by the time she took the stand less frightened. Laurel Haynes, who was a paralegal, and who testified with the particular authority of someone accustomed to being in legal proceedings. Nora Aldridge, who had driven 2 hours from the neighboring county and who sat in the witness chair with the deliberateness of someone who had been waiting for this opportunity for a long time. The pattern of their testimony created a shape, not isolated incidents, but a practice. A specific behavior applied to specific categories of people consistently over multiple years, predicated on the calculation that the people he targeted would not report, would not be believed, or would not be able to sustain the effort. That calculation had been correct until the December afternoon when 4 cell phones recorded 32 seconds that could not be recalculated. The morning of the third day, the prosecution called its final witness. Terry Boggs entered the courtroom from a side door accompanied by 2 correctional officers. He was thinner than his booking photo and moved with the compressed quality of a man who had spent too long in small spaces. He took the witness chair and looked out at the courtroom, and then briefly at Pearl and looked away. The prosecutor took him through his employment history at Hargrove Construction Services, his relationship to the company vehicle, the events of July 14th. He answered simply and directly and did not volunteer information beyond what he was asked. Then the prosecutor asked Mr. Boggs, "Can you describe the circumstances of your legal representation following your arrest?" Hargrove's lead attorney was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the defense objects to this line of questioning as irrelevant to the charges before this court." Judge Shaw looked at the prosecutor. "Ms. Mills, Your Honor, the circumstances of the original accident and the subsequent arrangement of Mr. Boggs's defense are directly relevant to the prosecution's theory that the incident in the diner was part of a sustained pattern of behavior by the defendant toward the victim rooted in his awareness that his company vehicle had killed her husband. We intend to show that the defendant had specific knowledge of his connection to her loss and used that knowledge to assess her vulnerability." The defense objected again. Judge Shaw considered for a moment and then allowed the testimony to proceed. Boggs described the phone call from Hargrove that had come 2 days after the accident. The assurance that a lawyer would be provided, that the case would be handled, that if Boggs kept quiet and accepted the plea, his family would be looked after. He described the 6 months of payments to his wife that had then stopped. He described the 2 parole denials that had come during a period when Hargrove's attorney had been in contact with the parole board. He described the $25,000 that had changed hands. Hargrove's lead attorney cross-examined aggressively, suggesting that Boggs was offering this testimony in exchange for favorable treatment regarding his parole. Boggs acknowledged that he had been connected with a pro bono attorney for a parole review. He acknowledged that the attorney had been referred by Vance Holden. The prosecutor redirected. "Mr. Boggs, are you testifying under oath today in exchange for any guarantee of early release?" "No," Boggs said. "Are you testifying under oath today because you were offered money or any material compensation?" "Number." "Why are you testifying?" Boggs was quiet for a moment. "Because the man who was driving that truck was me," he said. "And I've been living with that for 16 months. He paused. "And because Dean Hargrove put me behind the wheel of that truck and then spent money to make sure I stayed quiet, and I've had a long time to sit with that, and I'm done being quiet." The courtroom was very still. Pearl was the prosecution's second witness. She took the stand on the second afternoon, dressed simply in a navy dress, 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant, moving slowly and carefully to the witness chair. She settled herself, placed one hand on her abdomen, and looked at the prosecutor. "Ms. Briggs," Dana Mills said, "can you tell the court what happened on the afternoon of December 2nd at Harlan's Fork Diner?" Pearl described it. She began at the beginning, the day's arrival, to work the morning rush, the lunch crowd, and she moved through it with the same precision she had used when she filed her report, clear and factual and without emotional editorializing, which was more powerful than editorializing would have been. When she came to the moment Hargrove grabbed her wrist, she described the physical sensation of it, the deliberateness of the grip, the quality of it that was different from an accidental contact. When she described asking him to let go, her voice was level. When she described what happened when she tried to pull her arm back, it remained level. She did not perform composure. She simply had it, the composure of someone who had made peace with the worst day of her life once before and understood that she could survive this one too. The defense cross-examined her for 90 minutes. They suggested she had been disrespectful to a customer. They suggested the strike had been a reflexive reaction to her pulling her arm. They suggested the videos did not show clearly what had led to the moment of contact. Pearl answered each question with the same qualities she had brought to her direct testimony. Clear, factual, unrattled. "Why didn't you simply walk away?" the defense attorney asked. "I tried to," Pearl said. "That's when he grabbed my wrist. But the situation escalated. Isn't it possible that your manner contributed to the escalation?" Pearl looked at him. "I asked him to let go of me," she said. "That is the only thing I did." Defense counsel had no further questions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Pearl spent those hours in a conference room with Hazel and Vance and the others, and they mostly sat in the particular silence of people who have done what can be done and are now in the place where outcomes are no longer theirs to determine. Hazel brought sandwiches from the diner that nobody ate. Brooks made a call about Pearl's upcoming prenatal appointment and rescheduled it without making a point of doing so. Dalton sat in the corner with his elbows on his knees, turning his phone over in his hands. Garrett read something on his phone slowly, the way a man reads when he is not really reading. Silas sat with his hands clasped and appeared to be doing something internal and private that had the quality of prayer without its performance. Decker paced. Vance sat beside Pearl and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to say. At 4:17 in the afternoon, the jury returned. The foreperson was a man named Earl Dawson, a hardware store owner from the eastern part of the county, who had sat through 3 days of testimony with the focused attention of someone who understood that what he was doing mattered. On the charge of assault and battery in the first degree, he read, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." On the charge of stalking and harassment through retaliatory housing action, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation related to the coordinated defense arrangement in the Boggs matter, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The courtroom produced a sound that was not quite noise and not quite silence. Something between them, the collective exhalation of a room that had been holding a breath for a long time. Hargrove sat at the defense table with the composed expression of a man who had prepared for multiple outcomes but had not fully prepared for this one. His lead attorney placed a hand on his arm, a professional gesture of steadying. Judge Shaw called for order. She got it. She looked at Hargrove for a moment before she spoke. Not long, just the length of time it took to let the verdict settle into the record. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "the evidence in this case describes a man who used his resources and connections to harm the people around him, and then to suppress the consequences of that harm. The victim in this case is the surviving spouse of a decorated Marine who served his country and died as a direct result of decisions made by your company. You were aware of this connection, and you used it not as a source of accountability, but as intelligence about her vulnerability." She paused. "That this court has been unable to charge you directly with the criminal aspects of the accident is a consequence of the legal arrangements made in the original case, which the state is now separately investigating. But it does not escape this court that your conduct from December 2nd forward reflects a sustained attempt to use your power to silence and displace a woman who had already suffered enough." She reviewed the sentencing guidelines and issued the sentence. 14 months in county jail, not suspended, no probation option on the custodial portion, a fine of $80,000, restitution to Pearl Briggs in the amount of $25,000, and an order requiring Hargrove to divest within 18 months all residential rental properties in Whitfield County in light of the additional civil findings of retaliatory housing practices. The divesting order was the one Pearl had not expected. She looked at Dana Mills, who gave the smallest nod. "Yes, that is real." Hargrove was taken into custody in the courtroom. He walked to the bailiff with the controlled posture of a man managing his expression, and just before he reached the door, he turned and found Pearl in the gallery. She was looking at Vance. She did not look at Hargrove. Not because she was afraid of him, not anymore, but because she had decided that the last image she wanted to take out of that courtroom was not his face, but the face of the man who had shown up when she needed it most, whose presence in that room was the direct consequence of a decision her husband had made on a road outside Fallujah 17 years ago. Vance caught her looking. His expression did something quiet and complicated. She nodded once. He nodded back. Outside the courthouse, the January light was thin but present. The ice in the parking lot caught in the flat afternoon sun. Pearl stood at the top of the courthouse steps with Hazel beside her, and the Iron Road brothers ranged behind her in a loose half circle. And when the reporters asked for a statement, she looked directly at the camera and spoke. "My husband, Corporal Wade Briggs, served 2 tours in Iraq," she said. "He came home and built a life, and then he was taken from me by a drunk driver in a vehicle registered to Dean Hargrove's company. Hargrove knew. He covered it up. And then he walked into the diner where I work, and he tested to see what I would tolerate the same way he has tested that question with other women in this county for years." She paused. "What I want to say to anyone watching this is that justice is not automatic. It requires witnesses. It requires people willing to stand up and say what they saw." She looked at the 6 men behind her. "I had that." These men stood up first, and then others followed. 4 women I didn't know came forward. A man who had been afraid for 16 months found his courage. And something that could have been buried became visible. She paused again. That is what courage does. It is not loud. It is just standing when it is time to stand. She stepped back from the microphone. The clip ran on 3 television stations that evening. December 18th arrived the way significant days tend to arrive quietly, without the fanfare the anticipation had constructed around them. Just another morning, becoming remarkable through what happened in it. Pearl's contractions began at 2 in the morning regular, and building the unmistakable beginning of what she had been preparing for. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed through 2 of them and then called Vance. He answered on the first ring. "Is it time?" he said. She heard the alertness in his voice, not groggy, fully present, the voice of a man who had been expecting this call and had simply been waiting. "Yes," she said. "We're coming." 20 minutes later, the church apartment parking lot held 6 motorcycles and 1 truck. The night was cold and clear, the kind of December Tennessee night where you can see stars clearly because the air has no moisture left to blur them. The bike's engines in the stillness had a quality that was almost ceremonial, a sound announcing something. Garrett drove Pearl in the back with Brooks monitoring her contractions with the focused efficiency of a man for whom medical situations were not emergencies, but work. Vance rode in the passenger seat. The others followed on their bikes through the dark Tennessee roads, and if the cold was considerable, none of them said so. At Vanderbilt Hospital in Nashville, Dr. Wynn was already there, alerted by Brooks 2 hours earlier. She met them at the entrance with the prepared calm of someone who had done this many times and understood that for the people involved it was never routine. "Let's have a baby," she said. Labor was long. Pearl had expected it to be long, had been told by Dr. Wynn that first labors typically take more time. But the expectation and the experience were different things, and the hours of it were harder than she had anticipated in ways that were physical and emotional simultaneously. She was alone in the necessary sense that labor makes a woman alone, the body doing what it does with or without permission, requiring everything. But she was not alone in the room. Hazel was there through most of it, steady and patient, doing what Hazel did, which was simply to be present in the way that presence can be more useful than anything else. Brooks was there in his medical capacity, monitoring with the attention of a man who understood when to intervene and when to trust the process. In the waiting room, 5 bikers sat in chairs that were not designed for men their size and drank coffee that was not worth drinking and waited with the particular quality of people who have decided to be somewhere and are committed to remaining. Vance paced. It was the one thing that moved through him in a way walking could address the feeling of proximity to something important that was not his to control. He had been in this kind of waiting before, outside operating rooms, outside burning buildings. The waiting was its own kind of work. At 5:47 in the morning, Dr. Wynn appeared in the waiting room doorway. "It's a boy," she said. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Strong. Vance sat down. His legs had made the decision before he had. Garrett laughed, a surprise and genuine sound. Silas closed his eyes for a moment. Dalton pressed his hands against his face. Decker put a fist against Garrett's shoulder. Brooks, who had been in the room, came out with his hands still in gloves and nodded at Vance with the expression of someone who had been privileged to witness something. 20 minutes later, they filed in. Pearl was propped up in the hospital bed, exhausted with a depth of exhaustion that was also satisfaction, the kind that comes from having done something that required everything you had. She was holding a bundle in a blue blanket, small and complete, the particular perfection of a new person before the world has had any time to shape them. She looked up when they came in. Her face was the face of someone who had come through fire and was standing on the other side of it. "Everyone," she said softly, "meet Wade Vance Briggs." Vance stopped in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the bundle in her arms, at the small face turned slightly sideways, eyes closed, the miniature fist curled against a cheek. He crossed the room. Pearl held the baby out, and Vance took him with the careful precision of a man who was afraid of nothing except making a mistake with something irreplaceable. He cradled the infant in his weathered hands and looked at him for a long time without speaking. "Your daddy was the bravest man I ever met," he said finally. He said it to the room, to all of them, to Pearl. He said it because it needed to be said out loud by someone, and he was the one who had been waiting 17 years to say it. He held the baby for a long time. Then he passed him to Garrett, who took him with his scarred mechanic's hands and held him like something sacred. Then to Silas, who murmured something low and private that sounded like a blessing. Then to Brooks, who checked the infant's breathing and color with automatic professional attention, and then simply held him with the expression of someone who had seen too much damage and was grateful beyond expression for the presence of something new. Then to Decker, then to Dalton, who was the youngest, and who held the baby with the particular care of someone who does not yet trust himself fully with things of great value. Then to Hazel, who had been waiting with the patient certainty that her turn would come. She took the baby and pressed her cheek against the top of his head and said nothing, and the nothing she said carried everything. 2 months later, on a cold February morning, Wade Vance Briggs was baptized at the church where Pearl had been living since the eviction. The church was small, perhaps 80 seats when full, and it was full on this morning. The 4 women who had testified: Deputy Reeves off duty sitting near the back, Jennifer Slater, who had covered the trial, Tommy Benton from the hardware store, who had held up his phone on the day of the incident and recorded 32 seconds that mattered, Dr. Wynne, the regular congregation of the church who had taken Pearl into their community with the uncomplicated warmth of people who understood that communities were built by exactly this kind of showing up, and 43 members of the Iron Road Nashville chapter who had come on their bikes in the February cold, filling the parking lot with Harleys and standing in the back of the church in their leather vests. Because the inside of a church was not a place you sat when the seats were needed by others. Silas Donovan performed the ceremony in his dual capacity as Reverend and Iron Road brother, which he seemed to feel no contradiction about, and which the congregation seemed to find entirely appropriate. "This child is carried by more love than he knows yet," Silas said, looking at the infant in Pearl's arms. His father gave his life in service to something larger than himself, and in doing so he set in motion a series of events that have brought together everyone in this room. That is not coincidence. That is the consequence of a good man's choices still unfolding. Vance and Hazel stood as godparents. "Do you promise to stand for this child in faith and love?" Silas asked. "I do," they said together. Silas poured water over the baby's head. Wade Vance squirmed at the sensation but did not cry, which Hazel interpreted as character, and Vance interpreted as stubbornness, and Pearl interpreted as having his father's nature, which was all three. After the ceremony, standing in the small reception hall with the smell of coffee and cake in the air, and the sound of people talking, and the particular warmth of a room full of people who are glad to be in the same place, Vance presented Pearl with a wooden box. Inside was Wade's dog tags, which Pearl had given him permission to have mounted on a small board. A photograph of Wade in uniform found in the Marine Corps records Dalton had tracked down through channels that required some patience, and a contact in the records office who owed Dalton a favor. A copy of the November 19, 2007 journal entry typed on plain paper and signed at the bottom by Vance, who had added a single line below it: "I made it home. I came back." When he is old enough, Vance said, show him what his father was. Pearl held the box for a moment, then she looked up at Vance. "I have something for you too," she said. She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a photograph. She had found it among Wade's things when she was finally slowly going through them, a small snapshot that had been folded once and kept in the back of his wallet. She did not know when he had gotten it or where, but it was a photograph of a road taken from elevation in a landscape that was unmistakably not Tennessee. Someone had written on the back in Wade's handwriting the day it all made sense. She handed it to Vance. He looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his vest pocket over his heart. August brought the heat back to Whitfield County, and with it the anniversary of the incident. Harlan's Fork Diner had reopened in January after the completion of the repairs, with a new electrical system, a renovated kitchen, and a refinanced mortgage through a veterans-owned bank in Nashville that had heard about the situation and offered Hazel terms she could manage. The insurance claim had been dropped when the claimant could not be located for follow-up. The county health inspector had been transferred following a departmental review. Chief Whitfield had retired. Deputy Reeves had been promoted. Hargrove's properties were undergoing divestiture proceedings. The state investigation into the original accident had resulted in additional charges being filed separate from the trial relating to obstruction of justice and evidence suppression. Those proceedings were ongoing. Terry Boggs had been granted parole at a hearing in April after his attorney presented new evidence regarding the circumstances of his original representation. He was working at a garage in Murfreesboro and had not been heard from since, which seemed to suit everyone involved. On the last Sunday of August, Harlan's Fork held a gathering. Not a celebration exactly, more a recognition the way certain communities mark time. Not because it requires ceremony, but because being together occasionally and acknowledging what is past is part of what makes a community a community. The corner booth, the large one where 6 bikers had sat on a December afternoon 8 months earlier, now bore a small bronze plaque mounted on the inside wall above the seat. It read, "In memory of Corporal Wade Allen Briggs, USMC, who served, who was taken, who is not forgotten." Pearl stood beside the booth with Wade Vance on her hip, 8 months old now, and regarding the room with the focused attention of someone for whom everything is still new and interesting. He had Wade's coloring, she thought, and she was not sure yet about the eyes, and he had the particular quality of stillness that his father had carried, the capacity for being entirely present without demanding that the room notice it. The 43 Iron Road brothers were there. They came every month like clockwork, arriving in the early afternoon and staying through dinner, fixing what needed fixing, sitting with Pearl when the weight of things was heavy, making the kind of ordinary presence that is the only lasting form of support. Vance held the baby while Pearl talked to Jennifer Slater, who was working on a follow-up piece about how the county had changed in the year since the trial. He walked a slow circuit of the diner, showing Wade Vance the room, pointing at things, narrating in the low voice of an adult who knows the infant cannot understand the words but can receive the intention behind them. He brought the baby to the plaque. "That's your daddy," Vance said. "He was a Marine and a good man, and he did brave things without ever needing anyone to know about them." He paused, holding the small, warm weight against his shoulder. "He saved my life. And because he did, I'm here. And because I'm here, you have all of this." Wade Vance reached out one small hand and touched the bronze with his palm, the way infants touch things with total and solemn attention. Pearl appeared at Vance's shoulder. "What are you telling him?" she asked. "The truth," Vance said. She looked at the plaque for a moment, then at her son's hand against the bronze, then at this man who had walked into her diner on a cold December afternoon and changed the direction of what was possible. "He would have liked you," she said. Vance was quiet. "I think he did," he said finally. "I think that is the whole point." They stood together for a moment in the corner booth of Harlan's Fork Diner, in the August heat, the room full of ordinary noise, the country music low on the radio, the smell of coffee and pie and grilled onions, and outside on Route 7, the sound of motorcycles arriving the way they always arrived, with that low rolling certainty that announced itself before it could be seen. Pearl looked at the door. The Iron Road was coming in from their ride road, warm and road easy, filling the diner with their familiar presence. Garrett went straight to the counter and started talking to Hazel about the kitchen repair he had promised to finish that afternoon. Brooke sat down and began the quiet process of checking that everyone was all right. Silas found a child at the nearest table who needed someone to look at a scraped knee. Decker helped an elderly man carry a heavy bag to the door. Dalton sat down across from Jennifer Slater and began answering the questions she had been holding for him. 6 men or 43 depending on the day, moving through a space and making it better for having been there. Pearl watched them and thought about Wade, about what he would have made of all of this, about what he would have said. She thought he would have said, "I knew." He would have said it the same way he said everything, without drama, with the easy certainty of a man who trusted that things connected when they were supposed to. In the spring of that second year, Pearl sat in the back of a classroom in Nashville on a Tuesday evening and listened to a nursing instructor explain the updated protocols for post-surgical wound care, and she took notes in her small, precise handwriting and realized she was genuinely interested, not performing interest, but actually present and curious about the material in the way she had been before she had to stop being curious about things in favor of simply surviving them. She texted Vance during the break, "I think I'm actually going to like this again." He texted back 20 minutes later because he was not always quick with his phone. "Good. That is what is supposed to happen." She walked out to her car at 9:30 the Nashville night, cool and clear, and drove back south toward Mill Haven, thinking about what it meant to want something for yourself again. Not just to survive and not just for your child, but for the specific private pleasure of being good at something and knowing it. That was what recovery felt like, she thought. Not the absence of loss, but the return of capacity, the return of wanting. She had not wanted things for herself in a long time, and now here she was on a Tuesday night in Nashville, feeling something that was recognizably hers. She drove through Mill Haven and past the diner dark at this hour, and past the church and turned onto the north side street where the small house was waiting, the one with the blue mountains painted in the nursery, because Wade had loved the mountains, and she wanted his son to grow up looking at something his father loved. She parked and sat for a moment in the quiet night before going in. She thought about Wade. She thought about him the way you think about someone who is woven into the substrate of everything, not as a separate consideration, but present in the way you think about all things. She thought about what he would have said about her being in that classroom. He would have said, obviously, with that quiet certainty of his, the certainty that she was capable of more than she sometimes believed. He had always been the steadier one in that direction, more confident of her than she was of herself, and she was grateful for it, even now, the confidence he had deposited in her that she could draw on when her own account ran low. She went inside and checked on Wade Vance, who was asleep with the total abandon of children who are safe, one arm thrown above his head, as if reaching for something in his dream. She pulled the blanket up and stood in the doorway for a moment. "You are going to be fine," she told him quietly. "We both are." She turned off the light and went to bed, and the painted mountains held their place above the crib, and the photograph held its place on the nightstand. And outside, the Tennessee night went on about its business, indifferent and vast, and full of ordinary things that were, if you knew how to look at them, anything but ordinary at all. Some things lost leave behind something new. Some debts come due in ways no one anticipated. Some promises made in journals that were never meant to be read are answered by strangers 17 years later, because the world, when it is working the way it is supposed to work, does not forget its debts. Some people run toward the fire. They do it without thinking about it, without calculation, without knowing whether anyone will ever know. They do it because it is time and they are present, and because the alternative is to be the kind of person who turns away, and they have already decided that is not who they are. Wade Briggs had decided that on a road in Iraq on a November morning in 2007. The decision had rippled outward from that moment through 17 years and had arrived on a December afternoon in a small Tennessee diner in the form of 6 men standing up from a corner booth. Pearl pressed her son gently against her shoulder, felt the warm weight of him, the solid, specific fact of his existence. She had been afraid for a long time that she could not do this, that she was not strong enough to carry what had been given her to carry, that she would run out of the thing that had been holding her up through 16 months of grief and debt and exhaustion. She had not run out, she was still standing, and she was not standing alone. That is the story of what happened in a Tennessee diner on a December afternoon. The story of a woman who refused to stay down and the men who refused to look away. The story of a debt paid across 17 years in a continent of a soldier's hope, honored by people who had never met him of a child, named for two men, neither of whom he would ever fully understand, because the ways of goodness are quieter than the ways of history and do not always explain themselves. But sometimes on August afternoons in Whitfield County, when the light comes through the windows of Harlan's Fork at the angle that makes everything look possible, and the motorcycles are in the lot, and the coffee is on, and Wade Vance Briggs is pointing at the bronze plaque with his whole fist, the way children point at things that matter to them before they have the words, you can feel the whole of it. What it cost and what it made. What was taken and what was returned. You can feel the presence of a Marine who ran toward fire because it did not occur to him not to, and who hoped in the private pages of a journal he never thought anyone would read that someone would do the same for the people he loved. Someone did. And that is enough. That is everything. The civil case against Hargrove Properties for the wrongful death of Wade Briggs was filed in March by a Nashville attorney named Rowan Fletcher, who took it on contingency after reading the trial coverage and the Tribune articles. He called Pearl on a Tuesday afternoon when she was between nursing classes, and the phone rang with a Nashville number she did not recognize. "Ms. Briggs," he said, "my name is Rowan Fletcher. I'm an attorney. I've read everything there is to read about your situation, and I would like to help you if you'll let me." Pearl stood in the parking lot of the college building and listened to him speak, and when he was done, she said, "What does contingency mean?" "It means I don't get paid unless you win," he said, "and I think you'll win." She called Vance from the parking lot after she hung up. "I just talked to a lawyer," she said. "He wants to take the civil case for wrongful death. On contingency." Vance was quiet for a moment. "Do you trust him?" "I don't know him," Pearl said. "But he said everything I've been thinking for 16 months. About the vehicle and the coverage and what should have happened and didn't." "Then talk to him again," Vance said. "Take Silas with you if you want a second set of ears." She met with Rowan Fletcher the following Thursday. He was thorough and direct, and he laid out the case with the precision of someone who had thought it through carefully before presenting it. She signed the retainer that afternoon. Silas drove her home. They rode for a while in comfortable silence, the February countryside bare and brown outside the windows. "He's solid," Silas said finally. "Yes," Pearl said. "Wade would be glad," Silas said simply. Pearl looked at the road ahead. "Yes," she said. "He would." The case settled out of court in October of the following year. The settlement amount was sealed by agreement, but it was enough that Pearl was able to put a down payment on a small house on the north edge of Millhaven, on a street where the neighbors kept their yards and waved when you walked past, and where there was a room she painted light blue with a border of mountains near the ceiling, a Tennessee skyline because Wade had loved the mountains, and she wanted his son to grow up looking at something his father had loved. Rose Farley, the teacher who had been the first of the four women to file a report, started a support group at the church that met on Thursday evenings and had within 6 months outgrown its original room. Laurel Haynes provided pro bono legal consultations once a month for members who needed them. Connie Decker organized the childcare rotation. Nora Aldridge drove in from the neighboring county every week without fail. Something had started. Pearl was not sure she had started it. She had just refused to stay down, which was not the same thing as starting something, but was apparently enough to make it possible. Vance visited every month. He always called first, which she appreciated, and he always arrived when he said he would, which she also appreciated. He was good company in the specific way of people who understand that good company does not require constant talk. He could sit at a kitchen table and drink coffee and not say anything for 20 minutes, and it was comfortable rather than awkward, the way silence is with people who have been through something together and have nothing left to prove. He always held the baby when he came. Wade Vance had learned to recognize him before he learned to say his name, would reach toward him from across the room with the certainty of an infant who knows the people who belong to him. "You're good at that," Pearl said one afternoon, watching Vance walk a slow circle of the kitchen with the baby on his shoulder. "I had practice," Vance said. His voice was easy, and his face was complicated in the way it got when he was thinking about Daniel, about his son, about the particular grief that had no clean resolution. Pearl did not say anything. There were some things she let him carry without trying to lighten them. He set the baby down in the bouncy chair and sat back across from her and picked up his coffee and they sat in the comfortable quiet of the small kitchen in the house on the north side of Mill Haven. And outside, the Tennessee afternoon was doing what Tennessee afternoons did, moving through its light in the particular way of a place that has not yet decided whether it is summer or fall. Do you ever wonder, Pearl said, what it would have been like if Wade had been the one to get the letter? If it had been the other way. What letter? The letter you send to the family of the man who saved you. The thank you that never got delivered. Vance was quiet for a moment. I think about it, he said. I think about what I would have wanted to say. That because of him, I got 15 more years. That I buried my wife with my own 2 hands, and it hurt less than leaving her alone would have. That I started something that mattered to other men who needed something to matter. He paused. I would have wanted him to know that the years he gave me were not wasted. Pearl looked at her coffee. He would have been glad to hear that she said, "Yeah," Vance said, "I think so too."